Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea. If each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from, also give a like. And subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I'm currently writing this from under a bridge. It's a couple of hours until dawn, and the streets are dead silent. I'm fairly sure I'd hear the sirens when they come for me. I'm hoping that means I have time. I am under no false illusions. I know barely any of you will believe me, and I don't blame you. I'm a scientist, a pragmatist. I've always believed in hard evidence, in the tangible and irrefutable. Ghost stories were for children, and superstitions, merely these same stories persisted into adulthood. So I can imagine what it's like to be you, possibly curled up in a bed somewhere in the dark, scrolling through a strange story written by some distant stranger you have no cause to believe. I've been on your side many a time, but if there's a chance, just a chance that one of you may have experienced something similar, or have minds malleable enough to accept what I previously thought impossible, then I feel it's important I share my story. For context, I have go as far back as my grandmother Sylvia. I don't remember much about her. Most of what I know comes from old photographs and whispered conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. Sylvia grew up in a small middle-of-buttfuck nowhere Bible town called Driftwood, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the church bells regulate daily life more reliably than any clock. Her parents, my great-grandparents, were Old Testament types who saw sin lurking behind every corner and liked their early morning coffee with the smell of brimstone. They raised Sylvia to fear God with such intensity that she'd spend hours kneeling on the hardwood floor, praying for forgiveness if she so much as took an extra biscuit from the cupboard. There's an old sepia photograph of her I remember Mum kept around for a while, small and dark-featured, with a gaunt little face and lank, unkempt hair. She wore a strange, oversized robe that I later learned was the standard uniform given to the members of the New Eden community. If it's not immediately apparent from the creepy-ass name eyes, it's a cult. You might even remember them by the moniker they later adopted, after all the infamy died out. They were pretty notorious in the 1980s, when that Venezuelan singer, Solimar Valencia, joined their ranks. You may know them now as the Brides of Christendom, a questionable rebrand, but it worked. You know the ones. They stand outside Targets and Costco's, wearing those robes that look like bohemian bridal gowns, passing out pamphlets and targeting families with any young girls in tow. And that's now, with all the public scrutiny and police investigations. Imagine how bad it was when they were simply known as the New Eden community, a bunch of nutjobs, sure, but harmless and secular and best left alone. This is the world my grandmother grew up in. Now, I'm not sure what happened exactly, though I've done a fair bit of digging since it started, but my grandmother left New Eden when she was roughly 15. She was taken into a halfway house for underaged and disgraced young mothers where she birthed my mother. As far as I'm aware, Sylvia never told my mother who her father was. He must have been a horrible person, because whenever the question was asked, Sylvia would near about lose her mind. She'd get nasty, violent, would force my mother to kneel on sun-baked gravel for the better part of 8 hours whenever she asked the question. And when my mother would hobble back inside, knees bloody and face salty with dried tears, Sylvia would finish off the punishment with 48 hours of enforced starvation. For Sylvia, the more ribs you could see on a person, the more penitent they were. It's no wonder my mother cut ties as soon as she could. She would tell me that Sylvia would wildly pivot between a loving, delicate woman scarred by New Eden to a bitter, abusive tormentor desperate to pass on some of that same trauma to her own daughter. My mother moved states, got a job, and enrolled in night classes. She worked her ass off and ended up in a junior position at a civil law firm. That's where she met my dad, a paralegal. They fell in love, got married, and soon after, Mom got pregnant with me. The pregnancy nearly killed her. It started with seemingly normal symptoms, a persistent low-grade fever that doctors attributed to a mild, chronic infection. She bruised easily, so they pumped her full of vitamins and iron supplements. The tinnitus and heightened sensitivity to smells were written off as typical pregnancy symptoms. But then things started getting weird. My mother developed an overwhelming craving for raw meat. Not just any meat, it had to be fresh, barely touched by refrigeration. My dad would find her in the kitchen at night, standing in the dark, tearing into raw sirloin with her bare hands and teeth. She'd sob afterward, horrified by her own actions, but unable to stop herself. The hunger was all-consuming, primitive. It spooked the hell out of my dad, but he was a first-time father. Pregnancy cravings were a thing, and what the hell did he know? I was strong, too strong for a developing fetus. I broke 3 of her ribs as I grew, and the doctors couldn't explain how. But worse than the physical symptoms was the fear. My mother carried around a consuming, endless sense of doom that didn't abate until my birth. She couldn't describe it, couldn't rationalize it, but she was terrified. Not of birth, not of me specifically, but of something else. Something she could sense but not see. It was during her 3rd trimester that she reached out to Sylvia. I think the fear finally overcame her pride, her justified anger at her mother's abuse. No matter their strained relationship, she wanted her mama. And surprisingly, Sylvia came. I found my mother's diary after she passed, and that's how I learned about Sylvia's brief return to our family's life. According to the entries, Sylvia was different, softer, more present. She doted on my mother, cooked for her, helped prepare the nursery. My mother wrote about hope, about the possibility of healing generational wounds through shared experiences of motherhood. Sylvia was respectful, helpful, and anchored during a stressful time, until she tried to drown me in the bathtub when I was 2 weeks old. My dad found her just in time. He didn't see the knife at first, though, was too focused on fishing my tiny body out of the water. Sylvia stabbed him, but the blade caught mostly fabric and just a bit of flesh. She was small, malnourished from years of religious fasting and self-imposed punishment, so my father was able to subdue her while still holding on to me. My mother came running when she heard the commotion, and that's when Sylvia started screaming. The things she screamed haunted my mother, enough that she wrote about them constantly in her journals, etched permanently into ink-stained pages as much as her mind. Sylvia had raved about a curse on the women in our family, about how she hadn't been strong enough to kill my mother when she had the chance, and she wouldn't make that mistake with me. Apparently, she screamed so hard she coughed up blood. She begged my mother to end our line, said each daughter born was like rolling dice, and all of us would birth daughters, she said. Some of us would birth something else entirely. They took her away in handcuffs, still screeching about darkness and choosing, and something about rooms deep underground where the brides would go. The doctors diagnosed her with religious psychosis, citing her involvement with the New Eden community as the root cause of her break from reality. 3 weeks later, they found her hanging from a bedsheet noose in her room at the psychiatric facility. She left behind a single note for my mother. I tried to save you from being chosen. Now you must save your daughter. End the bloodline before they find her. My parents did their best to give me a normal childhood after that. They never spoke of Sylvia or what happened, though sometimes I'd catch my mother staring at me with this uncertain look in her eyes. But nothing happened. I grew up, went to college, got a degree in biochemistry, and landed a job in pharmaceutical research. I was the very model of rationality and scientific thinking. Then my parents died in a car accident when I was 27. The police said a deer jumped into the road, causing my father to swerve. Their car hit a tree at 60 miles per hour. The officer who called me said they died instantly, but I later read the coroner's report. The impact didn't kill them, the fire did. Witnesses said the car burst into flames before it hit the tree, though the mechanics found nothing wrong with the fuel line or electrical system. I spiraled after their death. Grief does strange things to people, makes them reckless, desperate for connection. That's how I ended up in a bar 3 months after the funeral, drinking whiskey like it was water, and going home with a stranger whose face I can barely remember. The pregnancy test came back positive 6 weeks later. The symptoms started immediately, and they were eerily familiar from my mother's diary entries. Like her, I developed an insatiable craving for raw meat. I fought it, knew it had to be bad for the baby. My mind searches for answers in science. Perhaps I had an iron deficiency and needed a protein boost. Maybe there was a genetic component. I held out for almost 2 months before I gave it, and fuck me, it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I'd find myself standing in my kitchen at 3 a.m., blood dripping down my chin as I devoured raw chicken hearts I'd bought for the dogs. I loved the sound they matsenu and muscle giving way beneath my teeth. The fever came next to constant, low-grade burn that no doctor could explain. My skin would bruise at the slightest touch. But there were new symptoms too, ones my mother hadn't experienced. I started having dream-shoreable, vivid dreams of dark, underground rooms where something waited in the shadows. It wasn't a memory. I knew that, but it was real. I knew that too, somehow. Harriet was born on a moonless night in October. The delivery room lights flickered and died just as she crowned. And when she finally emerged, she didn't cry. She just stared at me with eyes that seemed too knowing for a newborn. The nurses said it was normal, that some babies are just quiet. They ran some tests, signed the birth certificate, swaddled her, and gave her back to me. I went home a day later, alone and relieved. It was short-lived. As she grew, it became clear something wasn't right. Harriet never babbled like other babies. She didn't laugh or cry, just watched, always watching. By age 2, she was diagnosed with solar urticarian extreme sensitivity to sunlight that kept her indoors during the day. Her skin would blister and burn within seconds of sun exposure, so we became creatures of the night, venturing out only after sunset. The doctors ran test after test, checking for autism, selective mutism, any explanation for her complete lack of verbal communication. Everything came back normal. But I began to wonder. Small, paranoid thoughts began to fester in my mind. I saw the way animals reacted to hearth, the way neighborhood dogs would whimper and hide when we passed, the way birds would fall silent and still when she looked at them. At night, I'd often find her standing at her bedroom window, small hands pressed against the glass, staring out at our moonlit street as if waiting for something or someone. Sometimes, I swore I could hear her whispering, though she'd been nonverbal her entire life. I made a good show of being stern at first, demanding she go to bed. She'd go willingly enough. Oh, she always obedient. But after the 7th or 8th time I caught her standing there, rigid and whispering, I stopped chiding her. Stopped searching for her in the night at all. Truth be told, she scared the shit out of me. I'd simply stand in the doorway, watching her silently, rehearsed admonishments curdling in my mouth. One time, as if she'd somehow heard my footsteps, she looked back over her shoulder at me. We simply looked at each other for nearly 15 silent minutes. I swear to God, when I turned to walk away, I think she smirked. She turned 5 on a Monday. The brides of Christendom came on the following Tuesday. 2 women in flowing white robes stood on my doorstep, pamphlets in hand. Their skin was pale, their hair so black it seemed to absorb light. Familiar coloring. I saw similar features whenever I stared in the mirror each morning. I remember staring down at that pamphlet, debating with myself. But I'd been living with a strange little child for 5 harrowing years by that point, and I'd recently finished reading all of my mother's journals. I'd read Sylvia's warning. So I mentioned my grandmother had been part of their community once, and their eyes lit up with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Sylvia's granddaughter, one of them breathed, reaching out to touch my hand. We've been looking for you for so long. I shouldn't have invited them in. But I was desperate for answers about my family history, about Sylvia. They sat primly on my couch, their white robes pooling around them like spilled milk. We talked about mundane things at first: the weather, the neighborhood, their charitable work. They were articulate and warm, speaking passionately about their women's shelters and educational programs. Something about their careful politeness reminded me of funeral directors. Then Harriet wandered into the room. The change was subtle but immediate. One of them stopped mid-sentence, her carefully practiced smile faltering for just a moment. They exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction too long. The younger one leaned forward slightly, hands clasped in her lap so tightly her knuckles bled white. "What a beautiful child," the older one said. "Is she yours?" "Yes." "Biological? Why does that matter?" They began asking questions then, each one seemingly innocent but somehow wrong. Had she always been so quiet? Did she have many friends her age? Was she eating well? Did she sleep through the night? When was her last checkup? When I tried to steer the conversation back to Sylvia, they barely seemed to hear me. Their attention remained fixed on Harriet, who stood silently in the doorway, watching them with her unnaturally still gaze. "We have a wonderful children's program," the younger one said, reaching into her bag. "Many special little girls like Harriet have found their true purpose with us, their true family." Something about the way she said purpose made my skin crawl. I asked them to leave. That night, I heard voices from Harriet's room. Not children's voices, something else, something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. When I burst in, she was alone, but her walls, they were covered in drawings. I've worked in pharmaceutical research. I've seen medical textbooks with detailed surgical procedures. Nothing prepared me for what my 4-year-old had drawn. Women split open from throat to pelvis, their organs replaced with writhing shapes that might have been tentacles or might have been something worse. Faces caught in moments of transformation, skin peeling back to reveal something underneath that didn't follow the rules of anatomy. Not a simple child's doodling, I'm telling you. The drawings grew more detailed every night, more disturbing. She drew them with anything she could find: crayons, markers, her own blood, when I took away her art supplies. I'd wash the walls clean before bed, only to find them covered again by morning, the images more elaborate, more horrifying. Naked women being penetrated by shadows that seemed to move on the paper. I have no idea how she even knows what sex is. She doesn't watch television, shows little interest in books, doesn't speak with and therefore cannot be influenced by neighborhood kids. I'm not even sure if you could call what she drew sex. To be frank, it came across as more violent, ritualistic. The changes in Harriet accelerated after that. Her skin began to slough off in patches, revealing something dark and iridescent underneath. Her eyes gradually darkened until they were completely black, and her fingernails turned the color of tar. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of infection, but deep down I knew better. At the start, I took her to see doctors and specialists, but nothing worked. When they started mentioning prolonged hospitalization and tests, Harriet would act out violently, both towards me and herself. But at this point, despite spending a lifetime grounded in the exploration of the real, for priding myself in being an individual of sound logic, I knew this was something else. Nothing that medicine could explain. Something other. She stopped sleeping. I'd find her standing in different rooms at night, perfectly still, her head tilted at an angle that made my neck hurt just to look at. Sometimes she'd track movement I couldn't see, her black eyes following invisible things across the ceiling. The houseplants started dying, then the grass in our yard, spreading outward from her bedroom window in a perfect circle. I found her in the neighbor's yard one night, crouched over their German shepherd. The dog's chest was torn open, and Harriet's face was buried in the cavity. When she looked up at me, blood dripping from her chin, she spoke for the first time. The sound she made wasn't English, wasn't anything human. It reminded me of the sound oil makes when it hits a hot pan, all sizzle and hiss. But underneath was something else, something that made me taste metal and smell burning hair. I ran inside and vomited until there was nothing left but bile. Forgive me, but I was a mother, and I loved her despite it all. I buried the dog before the sun rose, feigned ignorance when the neighbors came knocking. I found the dog's collar days later, hidden beneath Harriet's pillow like some kind of trophy. She should have been locked up in a psychiatric ward that day. But I was weak, and besides, it wouldn't have worked. Desperate, I began researching the New Eden community. I found an online forum for survivors and connected with a user called The Wicked Below 82. She seemed to know horrible things about the community's true purpose, about the 7 compounds spread across North America, Germany, and Australia, about the rooms deep underground where they took the girls who were ready. Her messages became increasingly frantic as we talked. She told me about her time in the compound, about the screams that echoed up from below, about the girls who went down with flat stomachs and came up 9 months later with something moving under their skin. She would have gone herself if she hadn't developed a cancer young that rendered her likely infertile. Thank fuck for osteosarcoma, she'd joked. Then she asked about Harriet's symptoms, and each answer I gave made her more agitated. You need to end it, she wrote finally, before they complete the circle, before all 7 are born. I can't find her account anymore. I hope nothing has happened to her. But that brings us to tonight. Tonight, I woke to a smell like rotting meat. Following it led me to Harriet's room, where I found a pile of what looked like shed snakeskin, but I recognized the birthmark on one piece. The blood trail led to our bathroom, where I found her. Jesus, I can barely write it. I can't describe what my daughter had become. What sat in our bathtub looked almost right, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't properly process. Like when you see a face in a dream and know it's your mother, but wake up remembering features that couldn't possibly fit together into a human face. Parts of her seemed to fade in and out of my vision, as if whatever she was becoming couldn't fully exist in our reality. When she moved, her joints bent in directions that made my eyes hurt. Her skin rippled like oil on water, and underneath. God, underneath, was something that made me understand why Sylvia went mad. I did what my grandmother had tried to do, what she knew needed to be done. The thing that had been my daughter thrashed and fought, but in the end, I held it under the water. I kept whispering, I'm sorry, even as its claws tore into my arms. Even as I watched my baby girl's face shift between human and monster under the thrashing water. The hardest part wasn't the physical struggle. It was when she stopped fighting. When her face became human again, and she looked up at me through the water with those big brown eyes sand, reached for me like she used to when she was small. Like she wanted her mama to hold her. But I'd seen what was inside her now. I knew what was coming. I held on until the bubble stopped. And then, I ran. I don't know what I'm doing. I want to die. I should die. I shouldn't be in the first place. I'm standing under a bridge somewhere downtown, did I mention that? I'm wet and I just killed my daughter, only she wasn't, or she is, but she's also something else as well. To anyone reading this, if you've escaped from the brides of Christendom, if you carry their bloodline, please, don't have children. Don't let them complete their circles of 7. Something is coming, something ancient and hungry, and it's using our daughters as doorways. I know what the scene in my bathroom looks like. I know what they'll think I've done. But please, someone has to investigate the compounds. Look for the dark rooms. Count the pregnant girls. Maybe then you'll understand why I had to. If you think that sent chills down your spine, just wait until you hear what's next. When we first arrived at Halverson Station, Antarctica was everything I'd expected: white, endless, and utterly lifeless. The snow stretched forever in every direction, a blank slate under a gray sky. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the whole continent was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Our mission was simple, at least on paper: drill deep into the ice core and extract samples for climate data. But the ice doesn't give up its secrets easily. It groaned and cracked underfoot, shifting in ways that felt too deliberate for something inert. Adrian joked that it was a living thing, and we laughed. But by the second week, none of us were laughing anymore. The team was small, just the four of us. Adrian Falk, the biologist, was as excitable as a kid in a candy store, always bounding ahead with questions and theories. Natalie Reyes, the geologist, was quieter but sharp, her observations cutting through Adrian's chatter. Mark Toland, the engineer, was a gruff, practical guy who seemed to hate everything about the cold. And then there was me, Doctor. Elaine Carter, a climatologist who should have stayed in my warm office, analyzing data instead of chasing it across the most desolate place on Earth. The day we found the cavern started like any other. Bitter cold, the drilling rig groaning under the strain, and the constant hum of the wind battering our temporary shelter. I remember Natalie shouting something, her voice muffled by the layers of fabric wrapped around her face. "We've hit something." "What kind of something?" Mark asked, stomping over. "It's not ice. It's hollow." I felt the first flicker of unease then, but I pushed it aside. We weren't treasure hunters or conspiracy theorists. Hollow pockets in the ice weren't unheard of melt layers, volcanic activity, even ancient lakes. But when the drill broke through, releasing a burst of warm, humid air, the unease turned to dread. Warm air, that didn't belong here. It took hours to widen the hole enough to lower a camera. The image that came back wasn't clear at first, just shadows and glints of light. But as the camera adjusted, the feed showed something none of us could explain. A cavern, massive and unnatural, its walls glowing faintly with streaks of blue and green bioluminescence. And in the center, arranged in perfect rows, were pods, organic, translucent, and each easily 8 feet tall. Adrian was the first to break the silence. "That's not natural. Nothing about this is," I said, my throat dry. Against my better judgment, we went down. The cavern was massive, the air thick and humid, a stark contrast to the frozen wasteland above. The walls pulsed faintly, a soft light illuminating the rows of pods. They looked alive, their translucent membranes slick with condensation. Inside, vague shapes were curled into fetal positions, humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their heads too large, their faces featureless. "Dear God," Natalie whispered, her breath fogging the air. "What is this place?" Adrian approached one of the pods, his gloved hand hovering inches from the surface. "They're embryonic, developing." His voice was filled with awe, like a child discovering a long-lost toy. Mark grunted. "Developing into what? Let's pack it up and get the hell out of here." But Adrian wasn't listening. He pressed his hand against the pod, and that's when it happened. The pod shuddered beneath his touch, emitting a low hum that vibrated through the cavern. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a deep resonance that thrummed in my chest and made my teeth ache. The others felt it too. I could see it in their wide eyes, and the way they flinched. "Did it just react to you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's alive," Adrian said, almost reverent. "We should have left then. I know that now, but we didn't. We were scientists, and scientists don't run from discoveries. They document them, analyze them, explain them. Or at least, that's what I told myself as we set up equipment and took samples." That night, the first whisper came. It wasn't loud. In fact, I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all, just a faint murmur on the edge of my perception. But it was enough to wake me, my heart racing in the dark. "Adrian?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I stepped into the main room of the station and found him standing by the window, staring out at the hole we'd drilled. "What are you doing?" He turned slowly, his face pale, and his eyes glassy. I heard them. "Heard who?" "The pods. They're calling." I stared at him, dread pooling in my stomach. "You're just tired. Get some sleep." But he didn't sleep. None of us did. Over the next few days, things escalated. The pod's hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls and into our heads. The others started acting strange. Adrian became obsessed, spending hours in the cavern muttering to himself. Natalie grew paranoid, accusing Mark and me of hiding things from her. Mark, always the skeptic, started snapping at everyone, his temper boiling over at the smallest things. And then there were the hallucinations. At first, they were fleeting shadows in the corner of my eye, voices that sounded like my own but weren't. Then they became vivid. I saw my mother, long dead, standing at the edge of the cavern, her face twisted in pain. I heard her voice telling me to leave, to bury the pods before it was too late. I wasn't the only one seeing things. Natalie screamed one night, claiming Adrian had attacked her, but when we confronted him, he was curled up in his bunk, shaking and crying. "They're waking up," he whispered. "They're waking up, and they're in our heads." The first pod ruptured on the 5th day. I was in the cavern with Adrian when it happened. The membrane split with a wet, ripping sound, spilling a dark, viscous liquid onto the floor. The creature inside unfolded itself, its body twitching and shuddering. It was incomplete, its skin pale and patchy, its limbs too long, its face blank. But it moved, dragging itself toward us with jerky, unnatural motions. "Run," Adrian breathed, his face white with terror. I didn't need to be told twice. The station was falling apart, and so were we. The creatures had started coming up from the cavern hours ago at least. I think it had been hours. Time didn't feel real anymore. The hum was louder now, vibrating in the walls, in my skull, making it almost impossible to think straight. Every shadow felt alive, every corner too dark. Natalie was gone. One minute she was in the lab, frantically trying to burn a sample we'd taken from the pods. The next, she was screaming, running into the storm outside. I saw her shape vanish into the white, and I knew she wasn't coming back. Mark was still in the control room when I found him, shouting into the radio. "Mayday! Halverson Station! Emergency evac! Repeat! Emergency evac! Do you copy?" Static hissed back at him. The hum was eating the signal, warping it into something unintelligible. For a second, I thought I heard words in the static, faint whispers, like the ones I'd heard in the cavern. "They're not coming," I said, my voice trembling. He spun around, his face pale, his eyes wild. "We can't just wait here to die." "No one's waiting," I snapped. "We're leaving, now." He nodded, grabbing his emergency bag. But as we headed for the exit, the lights flickered. Then they went out completely, plunging us into darkness. And then we heard it. The slow, wet sound of something dragging itself down the hallway. Mark grabbed a flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark. But it only made things worse. The thing coming toward us was too big, too wrong. It was one of the creatures, but it wasn't like the others. This one had finished growing. Its pale skin stretched tight over jagged bones, its limbs impossibly long, tipped with clawed fingers that scraped against the walls. Its head was featureless, except for two black pits where its eyes should have been. "Run!" Mark shouted, shoving me toward the emergency exit. It lunged. I heard him scream, a sickening crunch as it slammed into him. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stumbled out into the snow, the storm swallowing me whole. The wind was a knife against my skin. The cold, so intense it felt like my lungs were freezing with every breath. The storm howled, whipping the snow into a blinding blur. I couldn't see the station anymore. It was just me and the endless white. But I wasn't alone. I could still hear the hum, louder now, as if it was inside my head. And over it, faint and distant, I heard my name. "Elaine." I turned, squinting into the storm. I saw a figure, staggering toward me through the snow. At first, I thought it was Mark. He was alive. He'd gotten out. But as it got closer, I saw its movements weren't right. Too stiff, too mechanical, and then I realized it wasn't Mark. It wasn't even human. I ran, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The creature behind me didn't follow. It didn't need to. Its voice was in my head now, whispering things I didn't understand, but somehow felt true. You were chosen. You belong to us. I don't remember how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The storm didn't let up, and the cold was dragging me down, every step harder than the last. I was so sure I was going to die out there. But then, through the white, I saw lights, faint and flickering, but real. It was the rescue team. They found me half buried in the snow, babbling nonsense, my body on the verge of shutting down. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Just flashes being carried onto a helicopter, someone shouting orders, the hum still ringing in my ears even as they wrapped me in blankets. When I woke up in a hospital bed, they told me I'd been the only survivor. The station was gone, collapsed into a crevasse during the storm. There was no sign of Mark or Natalie, and no evidence of the cavern. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd escaped. But now, sitting here in the safety of my apartment far from the ice, I know that's not true. I still hear the hum, quiet, faint, always at the edge of my hearing. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them, the pods, the creatures, the cavern, and I know they're not buried. Not really. They're in me. The shadows have more secrets to reveal, and this next story is one of them. If you're a 90s kid like me, you have fond memories of Toys R Us. It was basically a child's heaven, an entire store the size of Walmart, but only with toys. Infinite rows of Pokemon cards, Lisa Frank, Game Boys, Super Soakers, Tamagotchis, everything. Every time my sister and I went, it would be an exercise in manipulation. How much could we persuade our parents to buy for us? Because if they'd let us, we'd buy out the whole store. When I heard that Toys R Us went bankrupt, I found myself sadly nostalgic. One by one, the stores disappeared. The ones around where I live met the same fate as the Kmarts before them. They became abandoned concrete structures, surrounded by an empty parking lot filled with potholes. And, like the Kmarts, it seemed like they could never find a store the right size or style to lease the space. I saw a Spirit Halloween in one once, but it stood empty for years before eventually getting torn down. But then my sister Jess and I went on a road trip together to visit our sick mom, and during the drive, somewhere in the middle of Indiana, we found a Toys R Us that was open. I couldn't believe my eyes. We'd gotten lost trying to find our way back to the highway after stopping for fast food. We found ourselves in an empty parking lot, surrounded on two sides by a thick forest of pine trees, but in the center was a large building with the colorful letters Toys R Us. "Oh my gosh," Jess gasped. "I thought they all closed." But the store was clearly open. The lights shone brightly from inside, showing rows and rows of toys through the large windows. I slowed to a stop. "Can we go in?" I asked Jess. "For old time's sake, let's do it." I pulled into a parking space and the two of us approached. I had to admit I was pretty excited. What is it about hitting your early 30s that seems to punch up the nostalgia in your brain? It's like some weird defense mechanism, like your brain knows it's not so young anymore, and it's desperately trying to cling to the past. Maybe we also yearn for a time before smartphones and social media, when the highest tech thing was a 3 LCD screen showing Pokemon I don't know. By the time we reached the glass doors, my body was thrumming with excitement. For a second, I thought they might not open, but with a quiet whoosh, they did. We stepped inside, and for a second, we just stared. Colorful aisles of toys, as far as the eye could see. Paradise for a kid. A trip down memory lane for the rest of us. But then I took a closer look, and I realized there wasn't any Minecraft or Paw Patrol or newfangled stuff. There was a display for Pokemon, featuring Pikachu and the original 3 starters, not the weird-ass new ones nobody likes. There was a display of super soakers and Nerf guns, front and center. It felt like stepping back in time. And then it hit me. What was really going on here? Someone must have decided to snatch up a business opportunity. They weren't selling toys, they were selling nostalgia. Someone had opened up a store called Toys R Us, not caring about copyright infringement, and filled it with 90s and 00s toys. They must be packed when it isn't almost 10,000 at night. Wait, why was a toy store open at almost 10 at night? "Welcome to Toys R Us," a voice called out from behind me. I turned to see the store's only cashier. A woman in her late teens or early 20s, very pretty, with dark hair in a bun and strands falling around her face. She was wearing one of those choker necklaces that were so popular years ago, giving off a little bit of a goth vibe. "Hi," I called out, giving her a big grin. I was about to ask her if they had any Lisa Frank stuff. I loved that stuff as a kid, but Jess broke me from my thoughts. "Oh my gosh, they have Tamagotchis," she exclaimed, running over to one of the aisles. She picked up one of the keychains in her hand. "I always let them die. Maybe this is my chance to redeem myself." "You'll just let it die again," I laughed. "You can't even keep your plants alive." She stuck her tongue out at me. I walked over to the Pokemon display, picking up a booster pack of cards. "This looks like one of the original ones. Don't these go for like $300? "Oh my gosh," Jess said. But the price tag just said $7.99. There were only 2 left, so Jess and I each grabbed one, and then we continued deeper into the store. "Do you remember when Mom went to every store like a madman, looking for a stuffed Vulpix?" I asked. "That was your favorite, and they were sold out everywhere, and she was tearing her hair out trying to find one." "I remember," Jess replied, as we walked down the aisle. "She really didn't have to do that. But you were so happy. I remember the grin on your face. You wouldn't let go of that thing for weeks." As we walked, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The air was warm and damp. I could feel myself start to sweat. I found myself picking up the pace, walking faster towards the end of the aisle. Couldn't really tell you why, just a feeling, I guess. "Do you want to get anything else?" Jess asked. "I'd love to snag one of those Lisa Frank notebooks, honestly, with the unicorn on it." "What was his name? Charlie?" She shrugged. "Lisa Frank was your thing, not mine. That was one thing I hated about being an adult. How you were expected to take the color out of everything in your life, and I don't mean that as a metaphor. Everyone wears beige and gray now. Houses are all white and black, sterile and desaturated. Why is it wrong for a 30-year-old woman to have a rainbow unicorn notebook? I mean, not for professional meetings, sure, but at home. Society won't frown upon social media or porn or vaping, but they'll look at you differently the second they see your childish unicorn notebook. Fuck it. I was getting that notebook, and it would live on my desk proudly. We made it to the end of the aisle. I looked both ways. The back walls seemed to stretch forever in either direction. The store seemed a lot bigger now that we were inside of it. "Which way?" Jess shrugged. "I have no idea." I glanced over the back wall. Boxes upon boxes of puzzles and games were stacked on each other, like Mousetrap and Chutes and Ladders. I glanced down the aisle sand. Then I saw a glimpse of the familiar rainbowy colors peeking out of an aisle several aisles down. "Lisa Frank's over there," I said. But Jess was already walking in the opposite direction, towards a display of Furbies. A shudder went through me. I hated those things. "I'll catch up with you in a second," I said, starting towards Lisa Frank. I speed-walked along the back wall, towards the colorful aisle that was calling to me like a chorus of angels. That old childlike excitement swelled through me as I got close. I couldn't believe how excited I was. I'm a grown woman, damn it. But that's the power of nostalgia, I guess. When I got there, however, I stopped dead. There were notebooks and folders and plushies, all right. Except there was something horribly wrong with them. In front of me, there was a notebook featuring the familiar Lisa Frank yellow Labradors. But their eyes weren't brown. They were pure white, with just a single dot in each eye for the pupil. and their mouths were open to reveal multiple rows of razor-sharp teeth. And the unicorn notebook I so desired its rainbow horn was covered in bright red liquid, as if it had just gored someone. What the fuck? How are they selling this to children? I grabbed one of the rainbow leopard plushies off the shelves. One of its eyes was missing, replaced with a single white button. It reminded me of the mascots from Five Nights at Freddy's. Deteriorated, damaged, taken over by something else entirely. I ran out of the aisle and down the back wall again, calling for Jess. As I did, though, I saw the games more clearly. The mousetrap game showed a real-life mouse getting decapitated as kids watched, their mouths open with laughter. There was a game called Stab Your Dad, which showed a hand being pierced by dozens of tiny little needles, and a variant of Operation, which showed a drawing of children cutting into a real corpse. I broke into a sprint and finally found Jess, holding a gray Furby. "We've got to get out of here," I panted. "I know." She held out the Furby to me, and now I heard its little voice, repeating the same 3 words over and over. "I'm watching you. I'm watching you." She tossed it back on the shelf, and the two of us hurried towards the exit, not breaking into a run in case that prompted the cashier or someone else to chase us. But as soon as we left the aisle, the air shifted. Something felt different: the air pressure, the temperature, the lighting. Noise bubbled in as though we'd just surfaced from underwater. What the hell? Sunlight streamed through the windows. The store was packed. Women in jeans and windbreakers chased after little kids toddling through the store. Laughter and squeals of delight filled the aisles. Jess turned to me, mouth hanging open. "You can go back if you'd like." I wheeled around to see the goth girl from earlier standing behind us. Right behind us. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "Time isn't set in stone. You can go back to the way things were." At this distance, I realized she wasn't as young as I'd thought. Her makeup caked into fine lines around her eyes, and she had a few strands of silver hair poking out at her temples. Our age, or a little older. Someone who was forged in the 90s like us. Before I could say anything else, Jess grabbed my arm. "Look." I turned and my jaw went slack. Our mother was entering the store. Purple windbreaker, chin-length blonde hair and a neat bob. And in tow, a little girl with dark, wavy hair. And another, even littler girl, with blonde hair like her mom. "That's us," I whispered. We stared, paralyzed, as the child versions of us stopped at the Pokémon display. Our mom leaned over and told us something, and we giggled. "This can't be real." "So are you going to join them?" the woman behind us asked. For a second, with every fiber of my being, I wanted to go. What I wouldn't give to be back there 30 years ago, before everything happened. Before the disasters of our time. Before 9011. Before COVID. Before wars and genocides. Before social media and smartphones and ads took over everything. I knew how horrible this world could be, before I realized life was less like a walk in the park and more like a climb up a mountain. Blood, sweat, and tears. Before I knew evil. Before I knew true pain. Before I knew anything at all. And, most important of all, before Mom got sick. I stared into the Toys R Us, at the golden sunlight and the happy faces, and all I could think of was taking a step forward. Then Mom turned around, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Her face was all wrong. Her eyes were 2 empty sockets, 2 black pits, staring out at us. Her mouth was twisted in a horrible smile. It was only for the tiniest instant, but I saw it, clear as day. That's not Mom. When I turned around, however, I saw something far more terrifying. Jess was taking a step forward. "No." I lurched forward and wrapped my arms around her waist. I pulled her back. We both stumbled, nearly losing our balance. Jess was crying, clawing at my arms. "I need to go," she whimpered. "I need to see Mom." When I pulled her to her feet, holding her back with all my strength, everyone in the store was looking at us. Each and every one had those horrible, empty eye sockets. "Run!" I shouted. We turned around, pushing past the goth woman, sprinting down the aisle. My lungs burned, but I kept pushing forward. We turned the corner at the back wall and kept running. I don't know exactly how long we ran for, but somehow we found ourselves at the front of the store again. It had reverted back to normal. We ran through the glass doors and burst into the parking lot, taking in lungfuls of the cool night air. Then we leapt into the car and peeled away. Jess could barely form words. Neither could I. "You saw it all, right?" she asked, finally. "Mom? Us?" "Yeah," I replied. And then we both heard a crinkling sound from within the car. Jess scowled. She reached back and pulled something out of her butt pocket. "Oh no," she muttered. "I accidentally took that booster pack of Pokemon cards with us. I must have put it in my pocket when I was looking at the Furbies or something." "Throw it out the window," I said. "What?" "You don't want those things, coming back and looking for it. Throw it out the window." "But it's like $300. It's not messed up like the other toys. I think it's actually an original pack." "Throw it out the window?" Okay, Jess said. She rolled down the window and let the pack of cards flutter out into the breeze. Then we continued driving towards our mom's house, slightly less afraid of what was to come. What you just heard was only the beginning. Things are about to get much darker. When Mr. Marner's wife returned to him through Regen Services, it seemed like a miracle. I remember the day pretty well, despite it being so long ago. 6 years back, the van drove past my son and I at our beaten-up basketball hoop almost unnoticed. It was that discreet. If anything stood out in hindsight, it was that the windows were way too tinted, almost black. And normally this wasn't anything I'd consider strange. Only once it parked behind Mr. Marner's home did it catch my attention, as well as the other handful of neighbors that were outside that windy Friday afternoon. Since his wife's passing a month previous, the only visitors the old man had were his daughter and a few members of their church. So, of course, a strange visitor would stand out regardless of who they were. In truth, sad as it was, the main spectacle was that our neighborhood was not the place where a Regen van would stop for business. It was equivalent to seeing a Ferrari parked outside a crack house. "That's the brain, people, right?" Bry had asked, the basketball tucked under his skinny, pale arm as he slid himself under my own, still clingy in the way I would come to miss at the arrival of his preteen years. For now, he was still just 10 years old. The ones from the TV? Yeah, that's them. I was distracted by trying to spy the hubbub from our little hilltop apartment parking lot. I saw Bry frown from the corner of my vision and interpreted his suspicious quiet before he could finish setting up his throw. I caught the basketball before it could slam into my gut and grinned at him. I led him across our imaginary court on the asphalt with a dribble and made like I was about to slam dunk, a quick distraction from the curiosity churning in my gut. But Bry saw through it and yanked the ball from my grip. He seemed pretty invested in our game, or at least I thought so before he ran to the edge of the lot and stared down at the spectacle going on outside Mr. Marner's home once more. "They're opening the van," he spoke up as I returned to his side. "So that's what one of them looks like open. The van's all full of lights and computers and stuff. Aggie Manilu said in art class one time that, what's the word? Yeah, they brought back her dad a little long ago, and that's why she was gone for so long after winter break. They were celebrating. When the late Mrs. Marner stepped out of the van as a princess might a carriage, I understood why they would have celebrated. I'd been one of the people that ran to Mr. Marner's aid that cold early morning when he'd stumbled out of his house and laid in the cold powder snow with his hands clutching his chest. His next-door neighbor asked if it was his heart, but he'd shook his head and just pointed a shaking finger toward the dark interior of their home. It was as though the yawning mouth of the open front door whispered the news before my brain could string together the logic. Sally Marner was pushing through her late 80s, and a week prior she had fallen in her garden. She was stuck there, under the thick cotton weave of the sky's blessedly unshed snow, Before her husband, Willard, returned from the dialysis appointment their daughter Robin had driven him to, Mrs. Marner was back home from the hospital and in palliative end-of-life care before the sun was set the following day. Of course she was gone. Of course she would die. But her husband was still so shocked, so pained, as if no amount of prepping, even a lifetime's worth of knowing and understanding the concept of death, could prepare him for her loss. Through my feelings of condolence, I was overtaken by jealousy, that a love could be so strong its lovers are devastated, that death can so much as touch it. So when an identical Regan van showed up in front of my home the day my husband came home from the hospital, too confined to a brief remainder of life in palliative care, I was stunned and was at my door before either of the men who left the vehicle could knock. They didn't seem the sort to be driving a car like that, the kind of van that usually held equipment for a plumber or electrician. Their suits were finely pressed, if a bit ill-fitted, but they were the sort of tall and slender that could pull off that sort of poorly kept aesthetic without appearing bummish. "Can I help you?" The question was almost for myself. What could they possibly need from me? If this is a sales call, I'm sorry, but frankly, I could never afford your services. Mrs. Derringer, the tallest of the pair, smiled with enviously straight, white teeth. "You already know my name?" That certainly left a foul taste in my mouth. "We've traveled quite a long way to meet you," he continued. "Please, may we come in?" I thought about my son. He would be home in about a half hour, depending on the school bus, and my husband on oxygen in the living room behind me. Still, the Midwestern aspects in me fought with the two halves of their dual nature. The wanton hospitality that saw how tall and skinny these young men were, and wanted to bring them inside to the corn muffins I'd made that morning, and that ever-present knee-jerk reaction of, "Get off my property." And what new property it was, having only been purchased a few months prior. It felt good to finally have a stable home and to own the land beneath it, even if it was squalid and a constant work in progress. I don't know why I let them in. I wished I hadn't the moment they crossed the threshold of our front door. The air felt cold despite the roaring fireplace behind us. My husband lay soundly asleep on the living room sofa. The hospice nurse said our bedroom upstairs would be harder on all of us to keep him in. The oxygen machine my husband was attached to made rhythmic huffs in time with his slowed breathing, clicking as the thinnest hand on the clock might tick away seconds, a moment divvied on a wheel. Every successful draw of breath he took in on that sofa I anticipated being his last, and wondered if my oxygen would go with him. I'm Holt, the taller boy with blonde hair past his ears, held out his hand, which I didn't take. He curled his fingers in and smiled as though he were pretending not to choke on bitter food. "And my partner here is Vince." "Partner as in?" "God, no." Holt laughed the sort of way someone did to shake loose tension, like unwinding the cap on something fizzy to drink. "He's not my type." "We're sorry for your loss," Vince said with a suddenly morose tone, and it smacked me in a strange sort of sting. "He hasn't passed yet," I said. "Apologies. It's just that, having done this for so long, it's impossible not to see the writing on the wall, and if you don't accept our offer, it may be the only time we can outstretch our condolences for the hardship on your horizon. If this is your idea of a sales tactic, I'd highly suggest another field of work." I began bitterly. Seating myself in the armchair across the love seat, the two salesmen seated themselves on. "Is that your method? To bully us poor potential widows and widowers into buying your expensive services by making us fear the outcome we're already resigned to? Sorry to burst your bubble, but that sort of perverse psychology won't work on me." "You mean reverse psychology?" Vince attempted to correct me. "No." I showed my teeth in a mama bear smile. "I do mean perverse. We offer hope, Mrs. Derringer." The tallest one outstretched his hand to me to shake. I was surprised by its roughness, his skin dry and leathery, like a farmhand's. Reminded me of being on Daddy's old farm. He'd sold it off a few years after I'd married Christopher, and I kicked myself every so often for not taking Bry there when we had the chance. I wonder if I'd misinterpreted the salesman's overlong blonde hair as a surfer's when in reality, he was a bit country woods, like me. Don't mind him. He doesn't have the capacity for fully appreciating the delicate nature of this subject yet. He's training. We're all new once. Vince sighed wistfully. He's also prone to saying vague yet somehow comforting statements of the obvious for some reason. Always quirks with newbies. Regardless of him, Mrs. Derringer, we've got a proposition for you. Have you heard about Region Services, ma'am? Was I imagining it? Or was Holt's accent noticeably becoming more and more oriented toward the south? An old neighbor of mine, he used your product a few years ago. Other than the results, I'm not sure I know anything else about it. The ads on television at the time made it seem like some sort of memory regeneration service. When the van arrived at his house, I expected him to be taken away for testing or something, not for his late wife to walk out as if she hadn't passed away. I see. Let's start with our company name, here. He handed me a brochure, printed on fine cardstock, a texture that bordered on luxurious. I didn't realize paper could feel like it cost a fortune before. It felt like I wasn't wealthy enough to hold it. Regen is short for regeneration, as I'm sure you've guessed. And our services are, well, I just sell the stuff. And let me tell you, it does sound too good to be true. That's why we only offer it to those we know are in, well, dire straits. Dire, I repeated. Mrs. Derringer, what's the likelihood of your husband recovering from his accident? Vince asked. I don't see how any of this is any of your business, either of you. And frankly, I've bitten my tongue. But how the hell do you people know so much about our situation? Was it the hospital? That's a violation of our rights if they shared our private medical information with your company. And I don't know much about lawsuits, but... Mrs. Derringer, Holt spoke again. I can assure you all that's above our pay grade. We're armed with whatever information our supervisor provides us with, and we're meant to make a wholehearted sales pitch, which, I guess, ends in this question. Wouldn't it be better for everyone if no one had to die from some stupid mistake or accident? Age, sometimes we can't help that, but you can consider us like life insurance. Only instead of financial support, we ensure that you won't have to go without your loved ones before their time is up. Get out of my house. I could feel the disgust in my mouth, oily and bitter over the syllables. Please. But I kept the brochure clutched in my hand. When the two of them had left, with their black-on-black van down the road and almost out of sight, I opened the brochure and turned toward my husband. His eyes were open, sunken, as the motor function to open and close them was sporadic since the accident. He needed his eye drops again, but I put my eyes on the brochure first. Perhaps I should have let them do their whole spiel. A lot of the jargon printed was complicated and twisty. They think they can save you, Chris, I murmured as I used the lubricating drops on his dark eyes, gummed up with drying eye fluid. His pupils fluttered, and I wondered if it was recognition or fear. I wonder if I should let them try. Then Bry, now 15, found the pamphlet, and I no longer had a choice. I'd have to let Regan Services bring my husband back from the brink. Free, I repeated myself for likely the dozenth time. My breath fogged up the glass of the observation room, where I watched the regen scientists and doctors put my husband into a medical coma. This portion I wasn't worried about, especially because he'd been put under and in comas, both natural and induced, several times since the incident, almost a year ago now. The rest of the process was the nerve-wracking part. I still couldn't believe this was even something that exists, much less something I didn't have to pay for. Remind me of the success rate. The nurse minding the vitals from outside the room smiled, knowing I'd ask the same question about every 10 minutes. 80%, Mrs. Derringer. The 20 that didn't make it were much, much older than your husband and had a whole slew of health risks. I have full faith he'll pull through. I tried to let that comfort me. If I was honest, nothing about this comforted me. even the notion of my husband getting a new lease on life. I was too nervous, teeth practically chattering from the way panic had me freezing. But I'd be a fool not to take this opportunity, and Bry would never forgive me if we didn't at least try. They're dosing him with another sedative now, the nurse explained as I watched one of the doctors in identical blue medical coveralls accept a syringe from a nurse in a similar getup, only white in color. This one is a local anesthetic for the tube they'll insert at the base of the skull. And, well, some of what they're doing is stuff I'm not trained on. I'm vitals and prep support. They'll place them in the special regen isolation chamber so he won't be exposed to any more germs or bacteria. And from there, he'll get wheeled off to the other room where they'll perform the procedure. We can't watch that part. They say we wouldn't want to see it regardless. All these months of blood and tissue samples, physical exams, and the waiting. It's so sorry, it's terrifying. I couldn't help but admit. I think it's supposed to be scary, but it makes the recovery that much sweeter, the nurse smiled. It will be like your husband is as good as new. And it will keep looking just like him? I asked, biting my nails. The regenerated version of him? I can't help but hate the idea. A brain transplant into the cloned body of the person they're transplanted from. It's like all the humanity in me is twisted up over it. You believe in God, Mrs. Derringer? No, not really. Sort of, I suppose. I rubbed my head, struggling to absorb the reality of where I was and what I was doing to the man I'd married over 20 years ago. I mean, there's got to be a reason why we're all here, as a species, right? Maybe I do believe a little more than I thought. Maybe that's why this feels sort of wrong. I wasn't asking about it for you to go worrying like that, I'm sorry. I was gonna ask, you want me to pray with you? The nurse asked me with a tone so kind it sprung tears in my eyes, and wordlessly I nodded. Then I'll pray with you, Samir. X. When they at last brought my husband back, there was a strange feeling of relief, like I'd been holding my lungs so still from fear of breathing. It felt as though, if I'd moved wrong, everything would come toppling down. Bry was in the waiting room with both sets of his grandparents, some aunts and uncles, my sister and her kids. He stood up and ran to me, excited but scared all at once. At 15, this was one hug I was going to treasure, as I rarely got them these days. I tousled his hair and nodded at our family. It had begun. Waiting was agony, as waiting usually was. Hours rolled by as Bry slowly whittled away at my sparse stash of dollar bills and quarters for snacks and drinks. Ordinarily, we limited those things at home, but right now, I had more important things to worry about than a few cans of Mountain Dew. I don't understand why it couldn't be done in a regular hospital, I caught Mama complaining to Daddy. He didn't care much for hospitals anyways, but some hoity-toity medical facility was even less his speed. I couldn't really disagree. The waiting room we sat in was more like one for a spa than for a facility where they were gutting my husband's brain like a jack-o'-lantern and shoving it in a copy of his own body. Though frankly, I didn't know what a waiting room for something like that should look like anyway. This place gives me the heebie-jeebies. They need to do it wherever they can, Greta, Chris's mother snapped. Please keep your complaints to yourself. It's not your child's life on the line here. I'm still confused how it got to this point, Chris's father chimed in. Chris was healthy as a horse. All of a sudden he has a stroke that knocks him out a window, and then he's paralyzed from the neck down, still having seizures and strokes. He choked up. It isn't right. Me and you, he looked to his wife, we're supposed to go first. Whether it ain't right or ain't fair, it's still your boy, Daddy said. Be strong for him. Mark Louise, Daddy's right, I insisted, desperately wanting the subject dropped, as if I hadn't been plagued by my husband's health and potential recovery enough already. We have to keep faith. Rich, coming from you. Louise scoffed, but no one said anything more on the matter. Mama, Bry sat beside me and leaned his head on my shoulder. No matter what happened, whether my husband lived or not, this moment in between the beginning and the fallout was more precious than gold. X. This man is not my husband. It started small. The doctors assured me that his memory would be fuzzy, jumbled even, but would write itself out over the course of months. It had been over 3, and each time after his monthly 3-day stays at their facility, to observe him and make sure his new body wasn't under any sort of duress or rejection of the procedure. Each time he came back, his memory was stronger than the last time he went and was brought back. Our son was thrilled. Of course he was. No son wants to lose their father. I was hesitant, waiting for the other shoe to drop, or maybe even for Chris himself to drop. It was unnerving how right he seemed. He'd needed almost no recovery time after the procedure, and his scarring, though there, was minimal. I had expected many things, even miracles, but not total rewriting of what I thought I knew about science and reality as a whole. Bry wouldn't have noticed, but a wife knows. He chose the wrong cereal. That was the first thing that rang with wrongness. I'd left our bedroom early on a Saturday morning and found him crunching away on the same sugary cereal as our son on the sofa, while they watched some local hockey game on our living room television. Such a small thing, and under normal circumstances I supposed a wife would take it as a father trying to bond with his son. But the thing was, Chris was very particular about his foods. He didn't enjoy sweets, and he didn't enjoy hockey. He was a football man, through and through, and he'd totally blown up at Bry over the fact he wanted to play hockey over Chris's preferred sport. He was reading more, and faster than ever before. At first, I chalked it up to his quick recovery and free time from his lack of employment. His job at the construction company had graciously given him an equivalent position to his old one at a site a bit farther out, that his previous one, a whole new crew included, but it wouldn't start for another 2 months given it was the winter. Before, it was only ever magazines or the few books he'd read over and over in his life. Old Yeller, Where the Red Fern Grows, even the Harry Potter books since he'd taken a liking to them when he read them to our son some 10 years ago. He was reading everything now, as though no amount of words was enough to consume. Historical non-fiction about ancient Rome, cheesy romance novels, cookbooks. I'd even caught him with an astrology book on more than one occasion. A true dizzying mix of information. Was it the new lease on life? I told myself over and over it wasn't strange, he was just changed. I'd catch him peering through the cracked door of our son's room at night, watching him while he slept the way he did when Bry was a child, and finally able to sleep on his own. He'd pet our dog for sometimes upward of an hour, not while multitasking, just sitting and staring with a vacant sort of smile. When I spoke to our regen caseworker, she informed me that it was simply him adjusting to his new body, a body without pain, a body which may end up living an extended lifetime thanks to its newness. I supposed it made sense in its own way. The important thing to me, though, was that he no longer hit me. Of course, I didn't tell the staff at Regen Services that. The bruises that used to regularly discolor my skin from shoulder to knee were almost gone, just scars and permanent discolorations of burst blood vessels and blown veins that were easily enough explained away as varicose at my age. It was harder to hide the marks from Bry when he was younger. Wearing rash guard swim shirts and trunks to the public pool definitely helped, and I made certain to change only in the privacy of the bathroom or bedroom when he became old enough to start registering that Mommy had marks on her body that weren't normal. Chris caught me examining myself in the mirror. Our eyes locked in our reflections in the bedroom mirror, my mouth frozen half open in shock, and instead of lashing out at the sight of his handiwork or slamming the door shut at presumably his own disgust, he moved in to embrace me from behind. He held me gently where I stood topless, the intimacy so rare and confounding it almost hurt worse than any blow he'd ever delivered to me, and as soon as it started, it stopped. He left, and I wondered if the moment had ever happened at all. The final puzzle piece was when I woke up uncharacteristically early, around 4 a.m., and found that my husband wasn't in bed. This wasn't unusual. Since his recovery after the regen procedure, There were many nights where he'd wander out of our room, saying he'd walked around the neighborhood or read some more, totally antsy and raring with energy. I'm unsure if I'd caught him on a rough night, or if this was genuinely what he had been doing each night he'd slid out of bed, but neither answer soothed me. I saw a light coming from the living room below. I thought about some mornings where I'd found him conked out on the sofa, and decided I'd bring him a blanket just in case he'd fallen asleep down there again. The light, however, was coming from the hall bathroom, the one we rarely used except by guests. The door was ajar, and I could hear a voice. He was muttering, just above his breath, in a slow and monotonous manner I'd never heard from him before, and it sounded so foreign. Drawn out, repetitive, a strange, forced lilt in the center of otherwise almost hypnotized tones. I crept as close as I dared, fearing the floorboards would give me away. Was he sleepwalking? I moved closer, letting the shadows hide me as I watched my husband stare at himself with an expression so blank it was as no facial muscles save for the necessary ones to speak were used, and only slightly at that. I caught on to the repetitive sentence structures once they began to make sense, his voice droning almost like the way I'd imagine an insect would speak. Christopher Derringer, I am 46 years old. Your fave. My favorite color is green. I was born in July, the 7th month. My wife is a lovely woman named Audrey, and we have one child, one son, a boy. I am a boy, no, a man. I am a man. I work in construction. I am afraid of heights. I have a scar on my left elbow from a surgery. It means I can no longer play football. I love football. I was shaking. The voice was my husband's, yet something totally different. The sound felt like it bore into my ears the way the vibrational ringing of a bell might when standing beneath. The blanket fell from my arms, a soft sound that normally would go unheard if not for the stillness of the night. I wanted to run away, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. At best, I had caught a man trying his best to recover from a traumatic surgical procedure, doing what he could to regain his memories, and at worst, most sinisterly, this man was not my husband. Not actually. And it was the option that made the most sense. I had lived with Christopher Derringer for 22 years and knew him better than anyone. What set him off? What encouraged him? What made him tick? None of those attributes were part of him anymore. And now I finally had the understanding, the confirmation of why. Our eyes met through the reflection of the mirror, mine visible through the sliver of warm light slicing across me through the ajar bathroom door. I expected shock, anger, even sadness, something to cross his face. Not a smile, not a warm, loving smile. He turned to face me and opened the door to pull me into an embrace. Our chests pressed into one another, two heartbeats thumping at drastically different rhythms. His was perfect and steady. Mine raced as though I were being constricted by a python. Christopher hadn't hugged me with any sincerity in over 10 years. Not since the drinking, since the layoff he'd had way back then, when he'd first laid his hands on me with something other than love. He cupped my hand in his. New skin, without the calluses of all the years of hard work he'd put into his craft. I thought absently about how that would make his job that much harder when he returned in the coming weeks. I know what he did to you, Christopher said, in a voice both his and of someone new. I've also seen the memories of you through his mind. They're all so new that I have to teach them to myself as if I'm a schoolboy, learning a lesson from a video on an AV cart. Do you remember those? Christopher. I didn't know what to say. I guess I hoped hearing his name would snap him out of this odd state and bring us back in the ballpark of the game we'd been playing since our son was 5 years old. I know what you did to him too, he continued, and my blood was hardly different than ice pumping through my body at what felt like 40 miles per hour. He saw you that last time. You'd been dosing his bourbon with shots of antifreeze, but he wasn't sure for how long, just that it suddenly made sense why he was so sick. He'd just finished a drink when he caught you topping off the bottle. You fought, struggled, and it was you or him. One of you was going through the window, and he was too drunk, and you were too tired. Christopher, I understand. I see through his mind's memories. As much as I'm him, I'm also someone new. I swear, to whoever or whatever you believe in or whatever is in charge in this world, that I will never ever lay a finger on you the way he did. Maybe it's because this body is new, sober, or maybe it's payback for what he did for you, and the universe is setting it right. Either way, I'm here, and I will make our lives so much better. Don't you see? You'll never have to flinch when I'm near you again, or sleep afraid that I'll wander in drunk looking for a punching bag. I'm exactly what you need, Audrey. Please, let me love you. We kissed tearfully. I'm not sure whose tears I tasted on our tongues, but the salt danced across my palate the way blood used to when he'd launch his fist in my direction so many times before. I wanted to believe him, to trust that the nightmare, the long groaning nightmare of waiting to die at his hands or to be caught for his death at my own, was over. It was over. It had to be. Because this man was not my husband, and I don't think I mind in the slightest. You thought that was scary? The next story will make you question every sound you hear tonight. So I found a lantern on my front porch this morning. At first, I hoped it was some kind of mistake, maybe a neighbor's delivery left at the wrong door. But the longer I stared at it, the more I couldn't kid myself. I knew what it was. It was exactly the same as I remembered. Large and heavy, made of black iron, its glass panels smudged black. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a prank? But that thought faded as quickly as it came. What kind of prank would this be? What was the punchline? The more I looked, the harder it was to breathe. It wasn't just a lantern. It was the lantern. The one I've tried so hard to forget. I haven't touched it. I don't even know what to do. Call the police? Sure. And what would I say? Hi, officer. There's a haunted lantern on my porch. Can you come pick it up? No. I thought I'd moved past this. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, just a trick my mind played to explain something I was too young to understand. But seeing it here, solid and real, has unraveled years of therapy in an instant. I don't know who else to ask for help. Maybe someone out there has been through something like this before. Please, if you have, let me know. Because all I can think about are the silent streets of Lister Lane, the locked doors, the lantern, and the night it was my turn to carry it. The neighborhood was always unnervingly quiet on lantern nights. No cars on the streets, no dogs barking, not even the chirp of crickets. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic footsteps of the lantern keeper echoing through the stillness. People locked their doors and drew their curtains long before sunset, shutting out the night as if it were something to be feared. I used to sneak to my bedroom window, pressing my face against the glass and peeking through the blinds, just to catch a glimpse of the flickering flame. It was beautiful in a strange way. The warm golden light swayed gently with each step. I thought it was mesmerizing. My parents, however, hated when I watched. You shouldn't stare, my mom would say, her voice tight and hurried. No one ever explained why. I wasn't told much about the lantern walk, other than the rules. The lantern must be walked once every week, and never by the same person twice in a row. The lantern must be carried at a steady pace, from one end of the street to the other. The walk cannot begin until at least 1 hour after sunset. Under no circumstances can the lantern keeper look behind them before the walk is complete. Whenever I asked for more for the who, the what, the why, my mom would cut me off. It's tradition, she'd say. You'll understand when you're older. Yeah, that never happened. I remember how nervous my parents always seemed the night before their turn. My dad would pace the house relentlessly, his footsteps heavy and uneven, like he was walking out his fear. If I tried to ask him a question, he'd wave me off or grunt, his mind too preoccupied to form an answer. My mom was different. She'd sit by the window, still as a statue, staring out at the street like she was waiting for something, or maybe watching for something. Mom? I'd say, but her replies were distant, distracted. Yes, sweetheart. She wasn't really listening. She wasn't really there. It always made me uneasy, watching them like that two people I relied on so much suddenly turning into strangers for the night. I became pretty independent at a young age. On lantern nights and the nights before, I learned to take care of myself making my own dinner, running my own bath, and tucking myself into bed. When my little sister Danny was born, I started looking after her too. I was only 8, but on those nights, it felt like I was the only adult in the house. Even when she was a baby, I'd hold her, feed her, and rock her to sleep, while my parents stayed locked in their quiet tension. I know what you might be thinking, how could they leave that much responsibility on a child? But it wasn't like that the rest of the time. My mom was an amazing cook, always surprising us with homemade meals and treats. My dad took me bowling nearly every weekend, always joking that I'd beat him someday. They loved us deeply. But when lantern night came around, it was like the weight of it crushed everything else. No matter how much they cared, no matter how strong they were, it broke through. When I turned 13, it was my turn. That evening, just after sunset, there was a quiet knock at the door. No one answered it. My dad didn't even flinch. My mom stayed by the window, as still as she'd been all day. So I opened it, and there it was, the lantern. It was larger up close, and heavier than I expected when I picked it up, its iron frame cool against my skin. The intricate filigree dug into my palms, making it hard to hold. The glass panels streaked with black mold. My dad appeared beside me, resting a shaky hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything, just gave me a quick squeeze before stepping away. My mom followed. She grabbed my arm, her fingers cold, and whispered, "Don't look back." Her voice was soft but urgent, trembling with something I couldn't name. "No matter what," she added. Then she let me go. I stepped out into the night. Thankfully, we lived near the entrance to the street. I didn't have far to go to reach the starting point. I got to the entrance and, gripping the lantern tightly, started counting houses. Lister Lane was empty. Not just quiet, but empty. It felt wrong, like the air had been sucked out of the street. The houses looked different in the lantern's glow, bigger, darker, their edges blurring into shadows that seemed to stretch and ripple. For some reason, the street lamps never worked on lantern nights. They were just tall, dark silhouettes looming like sentinels. The only light came from a few faintly glowing windows and the lantern itself. The flame flickered softly, its warm glow steady against the chill in the air. I kept walking, my footsteps the only sound. I'd made it halfway, and honestly, it wasn't that scary. I knew this street like the back of my hand. Every adult had been a lantern keeper before me, and they always seemed fine afterward. Tired, maybe, but fine. There had never been a struggle, a scream, or even a whisper of something going wrong. I told myself it was just another chore, like taking out the trash. I glanced at the flame, its warm glow steady and soothing, and before I realized it, a faint smile crept onto my face. It wasn't so bad. In fact, it was kind of nice. There was something surreal about actually holding the light I used to sneak glimpses of every week. It felt like I was part of something bigger, a tradition I'd watched, but never really understood. For a moment, I forgot the rules, the tension, the unease I'd seen in my parents. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. But then I heard it. A voice, soft and trembling, cutting through the stillness. It was my sister Danny. She was calling my name. I froze. Her voice sounded so small, so scared. My heart jumped to my throat. How had she managed to sneak out? My first instinct was to turn around, to make sure she was okay. But then I remembered the rule. "Get back inside, Danny," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "You know you shouldn't be out here." She whimpered softly, the kind of sound she used to make when she was hurt or frightened. I sighed. Traditions be damned. I wasn't going to leave her outside in the middle of the night. I was already bracing myself to turn, ready to tell her off and walk her back home, when I felt it. Her arms wrapped around my waist from behind, trembling violently. I looked, she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as her words sank in. I looked back, she repeated, and then the sobs came. Frantic, desperate, choking sobs. Her grip tightened, like she was holding on for dear life. "Please," she begged, her voice raw, "take me home." We were still only halfway down the street, and I hadn't looked back. I gripped the lantern tightly in one arm, shifting it to free the other. Without turning, I reached back toward her. "Hold my hand," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "We'll finish together." She didn't respond, but I felt her cold, trembling fingers slip into mine. Her grip was weak at first, but it tightened quickly, as if she was afraid to let go as she cried into my back. The walk felt so much longer with Danny in tow. Her feet shuffled behind me, clumsy and uneven. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, trying not to sound scared. She didn't answer. Instead, she squeezed my hand tighter, her grip cold and desperate. I felt her other hand clutch the back of my shirt, her fingers trembling as she buried her face against me. Her sobs didn't stop, if anything. They grew quieter but heavier, like she was trying to hold them back. She stumbled behind me, her feet catching on mine every few steps, nearly tripping me more than once. "Danny," I whispered, glancing down at the lantern's flickering glow. "We're almost there. Just hold on." Her cries began to fade, softening into quiet whimpers, each one growing weaker and weaker. By the time we neared the end of the street, there was nothing. No sound, no cold, no small presence clutching at my back, the small hand in mine. I froze, gripping the lantern tightly as my heart pounded in my chest. "Danny," I whispered, looking down. She was gone. I panicked. I had just felt her hand in mine. She had been right there. My heart raced as I spun around instinctively, desperate to see where she had gone. It was only for a second, and the lantern's flame went out. The street plunged into darkness, and the faint, warm glow from the neighbors' windows vanished with it, like someone had snuffed out the entire world. The silence was absolute, pressing down on me like a weight. Then came footsteps, slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. Each one echoed in the stillness, sending a chill straight through me. They quickened. The sound grew louder, closer, faster, sprinting toward me at a speed that didn't sound human. I screamed, shut my eyes, and froze in place. My whole body trembled, every nerve on fire, waiting for the impact of whatever was coming. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving only an empty, suffocating silence. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching the dark lantern in my trembling hands, too terrified to move. Nobody came to check on the blood-curdling scream I made. Not a single door opened, not a single curtain shifted. The street remained silent, still, like nothing had happened. I called out for Danny, but there was no response, no sign of her. I searched for her, but she was nowhere to be found. The street felt endless, stretching farther with every step I took, the darkness pressing in around me. Eventually, I gave up. I made it home, dropping the lantern carefully on the front porch. My legs were shaking, my hands numb, but its weight still lingered in my palms, like I could still feel the cold iron digging into my skin. When I stepped through the door, my family was waiting in the kitchen, but something about their faces made me stop cold. Danny was sitting at the table, staring down at her hands. Her shoulders were hunched, and she looked so small, so fragile. "Danny?" I whispered. She flinched at the sound of my voice, her head snapping up briefly before she bolted from the room and ran upstairs. I turned to my dad, but he wouldn't look at me. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the far wall like he hadn't noticed I'd even come in. My mom didn't say anything either. She just stood there, arms folded, her face pale and drawn. "Mom?" I tried. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. Over the next few weeks, it only got worse. My parents barely spoke to me, avoiding me like I wasn't even there. Danny refused to be alone in a room with me, her wide, frightened eyes darting away whenever I tried to talk to her. It was like I'd become a stranger in my own house, like they didn't even recognize me anymore. Meals were never plated up for me again, and bowling nights became a distant memory. By the time I turned 18, not much had changed. The distance between me and my family had grown into a chasm I couldn't cross. Conversations were clipped, interactions tense, and Danny still refused to be anywhere near me. It wasn't just avoidance anymore, it felt like fear. It was like my family had disowned me without saying the words out loud. They never acknowledged what happened that night, and I was never given the lantern again. I moved out of state as soon as I could, desperate to leave it all behind. Eventually, I started a family of my own. We settled in a quiet suburb, far from Lister Lane. It's the kind of neighborhood where kids ride bikes on the sidewalk and porch lights stay on all night. We've built a nice life for ourselves. Now the lantern is sitting on my porch. This morning, I decided to call my parents. I don't know what I was expecting, but to my surprise, my mom picked up after only a few rings. Her voice was bright and warm, not at all the surprised tone of a woman that hadn't heard from her daughter in 14 years. "Hello, honey. What's got you calling this early?" I hesitated. Hey, Mom. I had some questions about the lantern." She cut me off with a soft, bemused laugh. "Lantern? What lantern?" "The one the neighborhood carried through the street every week," I said, gripping the phone tighter. There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought maybe she understood. But when she spoke again, her voice was calm and dismissive. "Sweetie, are you feeling all right? Have you been eating properly? We're making a roast this Sunday. You're always welcome if you can make it down." I hung up without saying another word. An unknown number called me about 20 minutes later. I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I answered. "Sis, why'd you hang up on Mom? Are you okay?" It was Danny. Her voice was bubbly, bright concerned, but casual, like we'd just spoken yesterday. But it was strange. She sounded the same, but different. I haven't heard her voice since she was 10, since the day I left. It was like hearing a stranger wearing my sister's tone, her inflection, her laugh. "I," stammered, struggling to find the words. "Do you remember the lantern?" She paused, then let out a soft scoff, followed by a confused laugh. "What are you talking about?" "You can't be serious," I said, my voice shaking. "Honestly, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you okay? You're scaring me a little. I can drive down if you want." I hung up. Her voice had been calm, warm, completely unaffected, just like Mom's. And then there was Dad's voicemail, which arrived not long after. It was short and cheerful, as though nothing had ever happened. "Hey, kiddo. Heard you talk to Mom and Danny today. Just checking in. Let me know if you want to go bowling next time you're in town." It was all wrong. So wrong. Now I'm sitting here, staring at the lantern on my porch. The flame is lit. Its glow steady but faint, casting long shadows that dance against the patio. My phone sits beside me, vibrating every few minutes with another voicemail. My mom, my dad, even Danny, they're all worried now. I haven't listened to them. I can't, because I hear it again. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Don't relax just yet. The next tale is even more unsettling. I'd been with my partner Jordan for 6 months when I became suspicious that she was pregnant. She had no wish to be a mother, a fact she'd expressed vehemently from the beginning of our relationship. Whatever maternal urges she might have had were devoted to an ever-changing zoo of exotic pets whose complex demands swallowed up the majority of her spare time and financial resources. Yet even had she given them up, Jordan was often away with work at some job that she refused to leave. So when I began to notice symptoms that led me to believe she was carrying my child, I was unsurprised by her denial. "It's nothing," she'd snap even as she trembled queasily against me at night. "It comes and goes. I'm used to it." It agitated me that she ignored, with gritted teeth, the obvious, each cramp and twinge of tenderness in her dismissed as the result of some vague ailment or overexhaustion through exercise. I feared that she would plummet into a state of utter denial even as her condition became visually evident, although perhaps it would not. Jordan was of a tall, muscular physique, her stomach as rigid as a curve of bone. I could well imagine her having one of those ghostly pregnancies in which a foetus lay so high and far up in the womb that it did not show until the last leg of its residence. As the months went on, Jordan's recurrent symptoms convinced me that this was indeed the case. Yet even my most subtle suggestion of visiting a doctor incited such fits of anger in her that I became suspicious she knew exactly what she suffered. Why Jordan kept it from me, I could only suppose the child was ill, perhaps, or bound to die, or fathered by someone else. This would have explained the frequent disappearances she had claimed were work trips, the validity of which I could neither prove nor deny. Jordan had never told me what manner of employment kept her so unavailable for a week or some days of every month. She was, in fact, elusive about many aspects of her life, to the point that I knew nothing of her family or birth country, of what friends she kept, or even what animals she tended. I was never allowed into the room they were stored in, the reason for which Jordan would never detail. My frustration and sense of disquiet surrounding her secrecy as to all things, particularly her illness, increased to such maddening proportions that I could think of nothing else. Jordan had always been elusive since the beginning. I'd found that quality in her attractive. Then, her silence, like that of some queen in a fairy tale, her dark, solemn eyes changed then only by lust, rather than the quick boil of her anger. I knew that there had been a man she'd loved before me, now cast aside for some unnamed infraction, that she moved frequently, remaining in one city for a year or so. That was all. I'd been unquestioning, intoxicated by the ease of her love, which came without the expectations or demands that had dissolved all of my previous relationships in my unwillingness to accede. Now I recognized her behavior as the fettering of truth. It disgusted me to consider how I had been misled. When again Jordan declared she must leave me to travel for her ambiguous trade, I attempted from every angle I could think of to convince her to decline the venture and remain home to convalesce. She had on her the wild smell of sweat and unwashed hair, her breaths the short, deep sucking of an attempt to restrain a violent nausea. How Jordan imagined she could work in this condition I could not fathom. Her denial of reality panicked me to the point that I stood in the doorway of my flat to prevent her from departing to her own abode, insisting that she accept help before her ailment consumed her. I watched Jordan's still face erupt with a sudden fury she quickly restrained like a subliminal frame in a piece of film, and in almost an instinctual motion, I stepped aside from the door so she could pass. "When are you coming back?" I asked weakly. But she didn't answer, only strode off down the hallway, her hardened shoulders bent slightly in the throes of her condition. The sight of her turned back elicited a dart of fear through me, not for my partner, but for myself. I couldn't identify where it had come from or where it had begun, for as I felt it I realized that it had been a germ within me for some time. The following day, the first of that month without Jordan, who had sent word of having left by train in an elusive hour of the morning, I went about my work within a state of restlessness, unable to rid myself of the crawling sense that something in Jordan was misaligned, not right, that it had nothing to do with the child I was convinced we'd made together. I walked home from the office that night, winding by habit down the street on which Jordan lived. The weather was filthy, a knifing horizontal rain that swept beneath the tatters of my umbrella into my mouth, filling it with the taste of iron and tarmac sent up from the road. Through a threadbare quilt of cloud, the moon stared out like the eye of a blind dog. And with its light I saw that Jordan's car was still in the driveway of her house, unmoved since the day before. A pulse of anger that she had lied to me caught me up in its red grasp before the perturbation that had previously haunted me struck in like a second source of wind. I ran up to the door and knocked, unsure if Jordan would answer or if I'd be turned away into the rain. Yet in under a minute she answered, staring at me with a dull, pained resignation. "You didn't go to work," I said redundantly. "Too sick?" "Yeah," Jordan muttered. And then she added, "You shouldn't have come." I was startled by how quickly her appearance had declined. The tail of her long black hair adhered to her back with sickly moisture, her powerful body covered only by an old nightdress, as though she could not bear the inexistent heat. She seemed to stand only by the crutch of her hand on the door, a tangle of veins worming along her forearm. "I'm coming in," I announced, and gently pushed past her into the dark house. Almost at once, Jordan twisted aside and pelted upstairs to the bathroom, the lumbering speed of the action throwing me off balance. I went after her, thinking to offer her some comfort, and to coax her into seeking medical aid at last. I found Jordan crouched over the toilet bowl, her nightgown slicked to her form like fruit peel with nauseous sweat, her jaws strained open in dry, retching motions, her form undulating in the tide of her struggle, until it scarcely seemed a thing with joints, and more an amorphous suggestion drawn from the dreams of a woman afraid of the change in her. "Jesus," I said faintly, "let me get you some water." Surely now she couldn't deny my suspicions that it was our child that had made her so ill, I thought. Yet the longer she poured, choking, over the porcelain gripped between her knotted hands, the greater heights to which my nervous doubts crept up like sun-thrown shadows. "Jordan," I said, reaching out to touch the ridge of her shoulder, "tell me what to do. Do you need an ambulance?" At this she wrenched her arm from under my grip, and her strength even in illness amazed me, as did the snarling depth of her voice as she answered, "No. Go home, Ryan. Go home." There was a strange quality to her words, a rolling timbre as though distorted by the effects of some machine. Drawing back my hand from her, I was appalled to see blood on my palm, and upon her shoulder where I'd touched it. At the neck of Jordan's nightdress, something odd had affected the skin. It had gathered together, splitting open in a glistening aperture, through which I glimpsed a surface that was not muscle. Shouting, I tumbled sideways into the sink, streaking the basin with ropes of dark blood. Jordan's face was hidden in a cave of damp hair. Only when she threw back her head in a yell of agony did I see her face had shifted, both jaws sliding out of her skull like some spontaneous dental malformation. Her eyes, molten with pressure, rolled from the knife cuts of narrowed eye sockets into the basin of water below. I watched in stillness under terror's curse, so close that I felt the humidity of Jordan's wounds upon my face, smelled blood and the reek of dank animal fur, that which I had seen through the slit in her skin. Her teeth dropped like shattered icicles into the toilet. New pikes of bone pushed down through the cavities of her gums in their place. Eyes yellow and blind with pain arose in place of the old, and as Jordan raised one hand to clutch at her face, I saw the knuckles bent in two, nails coiled in vicious crescents of black enamel. Jordan stood shaking and groaning on her hind legs, the rag of her nightdress torn off in the vehemence of her change, and still I could not move, though I knew now why she had kept so many animals, and why once a month I was driven away. "Go," said Jordan again, and the command had many syllables, language forced through the throat of a beast. Whether she would have retained her speech or human faculties much longer after that, I'll never know. Pushing off from the sink, I vaulted out of the room and ran through the house, aware with every step of Jordan staggering after me in chase. Only by the time I'd reached the hallway and gotten open the front door, was she on all fours as she clearly yearned to be. My last glimpse of Jordan was of a tortured lunatic abomination, human enough even beneath the hair and the crossed swords of teeth that she appeared as what she was, a woman forced to kneel by the disfiguring strength of her moon-born disease. I spent the remainder of the night in a horror-struck delirium, tossing about so furiously in my bed that there were times I thought she must have caught me with some light scratch I'd been too drowned by my adrenaline to notice, and that I too would change. As it was, I recovered by morning, having in my fever accepted what I'd seen, even if I had no understanding of it. I remembered that Jordan had driven me out, had saved me from my own stupidity in that curious trespass on her night alone, and knew that I still loved her, though she would have killed or turned me in the end. So I went out to look for her, knocking upon her front door at the height of day when I knew it was safe. I heard her shift about in the house, but for all that I called and pleaded for her to answer, she refused to open the door. Possessing no key to the house, I had no way in except by force, which I knew better than to attempt. I did, however, stand at the window of the menagerie room to squint through a gap in the curtains, drawn despite myself by the question of what had become of the inhabitants. The cage doors stood open, each warped by force into shapes like weird alien skeletons. Across the floor lay a rug of drying blood, the heads of animals and tangled viscera parts submerged and stamped by the green-black stones of flies, like ropes of filthy jewels. As I stared upon that death room, my eyes became accustomed to its dingy light, and identified from the assorted matter that at least one of the creatures housed there had been human. I jumped away from the window as though hauled back by a cord at the base of my spine, and retreated to the other side of the street, aware even as I did so of something shifting behind the windows of my lover's house. What it thought as it watched me waver, heaving into a gutter, I do not know. I only knew that it had loved me alone enough to spare me from the starving curse of moonlight or the cage. You might want to keep the lights on, for this next one, it's not for the faint of heart. I awoke to the blaring sound of my phone alarm, dizzy and disoriented. I almost ignored it momentarily, but panic shot through me like an electric jolt. I grabbed my phone, squinting at the time. 4:02 a.m. Oh shit, I muttered, repeating it like a mantra as I bolted out of bed. I was late for work. The room was pitch black, no light from the hallway, no glow from the microwave clock. I quickly realized the power was out. My half-charged phone became my makeshift flashlight as I fumbled to get dressed. I kissed Rachel, my wife, and my daughter, whispering quickly, "Love you," before rushing out the door. But as I looked down at my daughter, her small face still frozen in sleep, something tugged at my chest. I should have taken more time. I should have kissed her, told her I loved her more than just in passing. It was one of those moments you don't realize you'll regret until it's too late. When I stepped outside, the whole complex was swallowed in darkness. No streetlights, no porch lights, not even the moon's faint glow. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, and the silence was unsettling, broken only by the faint hum of a distant car engine. It's just a power outage, I told myself, sliding into my car. But as I drove, the darkness didn't let up. My headlights barely pierced it, illuminating only a few feet of road ahead. The void surrounding me stretched endlessly, like something was blotting out the world. I passed a few other cars on the highway, their headlights flickering weakly in the gloom, like candles in a storm. One driver honked and waved frantically as they sped past, their face pale and wide-eyed. Another car pulled over, its hazard lights blinking weakly before cutting out entirely. Unease settled in my stomach, but I kept driving. The radio crackled to life with bursts of static and half-finished sentences, engulfed the city at approximately. Static / authorities urge residents to. Static, stay indoors until further notice. I turned it off, gripping the wheel tightly. Something wasn't right. That's when I saw it. A cluster of bright lights shimmered in the sky ahead, grouped in an unnatural pattern. At first, I thought it was a constellation or aurora borealis, but the lights were too close and vivid. They shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like embers drifting in a breeze. I pulled into the lot of a gas station, desperate to find others. A handful of cars were parked haphazardly, their drivers standing outside, staring at the sky. I stepped out and approached them. "Hey!" I called, jogging toward the group. A woman stood there, clutching a child tightly, rocking him back and forth without a word. Her face was pale, eyes filled with a haunted kind of worry. An older man leaned on a cane, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. A young guy in a baseball cap stood beside them, looking equally unnerved. "Does anyone know what's going on? Is this just a blackout?" I asked, trying to steady my voice, my heart pounding harder every second. The woman didn't respond. She just held the child tighter, rocking him faster. The young guy muttered, "I thought it was just the city. But this?" He gestured to the sky, his hand trembling. The older man finally spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "Where are the stars?" I froze and looked up. He was right. The rest of the sky was empty, no stars. Moon. Nothing. Just that shifting cluster of lights hanging in the air like some unnatural force. My stomach churned. "What the hell is that?" Before I could say anything else, the cluster moved. Slowly, deliberately, the lights spiraled inward, folding over themselves. For a brief moment, I saw the stars beyond the stars we'd been missing, then they disappeared again, swallowed by the shifting mass. The toddler started screaming, a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the air. I felt it in my bonus the instinct that told me to run. The lights shifted again, and I realized what I saw with growing dread. It wasn't a cluster of stars. It was teeth. The lights formed the edges of a massive spiraling maw, its ridges twisting and curling like a slow, deliberate blink. The darkness wasn't the night sky, it was the body of something so massive it blotted out everything. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. My heart pounded in my chest, too fast, too hard. Around me, people started screaming. The air grew frigid, and the ground began to tremble violently. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. What was I even running from? There was nowhere to go. Then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. At first I thought it was just the absence of sound, the stillness of the world around me. But as the seconds stretched, I realized something far worse. The silence wasn't natural. It felt wrong, almost painful. My ears rang with a pressure I couldn't shake off, as though something was crushing my eardrums from the inside. The toddler's cries, the rumble of the ground, even my panicked breaths, all of it was gone. My body trembled, but I couldn't hear the shaking. The world had gone mute, not from the absence of sound but from its crushing weight, as if the air had become so thick that sound could no longer travel. I watched in horror as the gas station sign bent, snapping like a twig under an invisible force. The woman clutched her child, her mouth open in a silent scream. The older man's cane snapped in half as he collapsed. The young man's car crumpled like paper, swallowed whole by the void. I dropped to my knees, pressing my hands against my ears in a futile attempt to stop the pressure. But the silence was not something I could escape. I closed my eyes momentarily, trying to breathe and think of Rachel, my daughter. The things I hadn't done, the moments I hadn't shared. Maybe this was it. Perhaps this was the end. But even as the darkness closed in, I could still remember them family. The ones I'd failed to love enough to hold close. I let go. Each story gets eerier than the last. And this next one is no exception. I can't be the only one. Ever since I was a kid, I would run up the basement stairs because I was scared someone was going to grab my leg. I would be in a full-on sprint, all while trying to hit the light switch on my way up. There was always this constant feeling that something lurked behind me as I was coming back upstairs. In my childhood home, the game room was in the basement. You know what kind of basement I'm talking about. TV down there, Xbox, board games, computer, pool table. Maybe it was me being a dumb kid, but I continued to do it for years. It became a habit for me. Go downstairs, hang out, play games, watch TV. The end of the night would come, and my Olympic training would start. Turn the TV off, swipe for the light as I sprint up the stairs, and then shut the door. Obviously, nothing ever grabbed me. It was just that fear of what was lurking in the dark behind me that gave me goosebumps. I would love to tell you, as I got older, I stopped doing it. But I didn't. I was a chicken, and I'm not afraid to admit it. I slept with a nightlight until I was 13. I never left a closet door open when I went to sleep, and even as an adult, I always check the back seat of my car when I get in. My parents are retiring to Florida, and instead of selling the house right away, they decided to ask me if I had any interest in moving back in. The house is paid off, so I would just have to cover utilities. I got a pretty good job right out of college, and can afford it, so I figured I would keep the memories alive and move in. The only downside to moving in is that I would be living alone. I did have family close by, which was a plus, but living by myself would be so strange. I lived with my parents until college, and during my college years, I always had a roommate, whether I lived in a dorm or an off-campus apartment. The night before my parents were moving out, we had a little going-away party for them. A ton of food and lots of drinks were had. My older sister lived a few blocks away, so the entire family was there. It was a fun yet emotional night. I know my parents weren't leaving forever, and I would still see them, but it still felt like a little piece of me was being taken on their retirement adventures. During the get-together, I pulled my mom to the side and asked if there was anything I should be concerned about when taking on the house. Any leaks, damage, problems, or creepy spirits I should be worried about. I may have presented that last part as a joke, but like I said, I was a chicken and was just slightly concerned about how I would handle living alone. My mom assured me that there were no problems with the house, and that once I got used to normal house maintenance, it would be smooth sailing. Jason, you have to keep the house clean. You no longer have the luxury of an unpaid maid. We just remodeled the kitchen not too long ago, so all the appliances are new. My biggest worry with you is your laundry. Really, Ma? My laundry? Yes, Jason. You would always let all your dirty clothes build up, and when you would come visit, I would have to haul all your bags down to the basement and spend what felt like days washing and drying them. I thought you loved doing that, Madre. That's why I would always save it for you, I said with a big grin on my face. My mom nudged me on the arm and walked away, sighing and laughing. I hadn't even thought about that. Not only would I have to be in the house alone, not only would I have to laundry, but I would have to go to the basement alone. I leaned back against the wall and thought to myself, what the hell am I so worried about? I am a grown-ass man. This is the stupidest thing to be concerned about. A basement? That's my biggest concern, being scared of the dark as I run up the stairs? The thought alone made me laugh. It was ridiculous. I needed to grow up. The basement hadn't gotten much use as I got older. I started to go out more and hang with friends and was barely even home. Then once I went to college, my visits home consisted of eating homemade food, seeing family, and going out drinking with friends. The pep talk to myself ended when I heard what sounded like a stampede coming up the basement steps. For a split second, I thought it was in my head until my nephew busted through the basement door. Breathing heavy and in near tears, he ran straight to his mother. "Joey, are you okay? What happened?" my sister asked. Still catching his breath, Joey answered, "Mom, there is something downstairs." "What are you talking about? Why were you in the basement?" I interrupted. "What did you see downstairs?" "I didn't see anything. I was coming up the stairs and someone tried to grab my leg." My sister's husband told his son to calm down and gave him a hug. He told him he would go in the basement and check. While everyone else in the house may think he was just a scared kid whose imagination got the best of him, for some reason I believed him. I can't tell you what it was, but I know he had the same feelings I had as a kid every time I came up those stairs. He felt like something was behind him. I would be lying if I told you I wasn't terrified. I never told anyone about the little routine I had when coming up the stairs from the basement, so nobody else seemed to be concerned. My sister was calming my nephew down as my brother-in-law made his way to the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. I watched as he passed by the staircase several times, looking around for someone, something, anything. He found nothing. He made his way back upstairs and he assured my nephew there was nothing down there and nothing to worry about. The night ended shortly after that. I said goodbye to my family and went over to hug my nephew. "Uncle Jason, what's up, pal? There is something down there. Be careful." He gave me a hug that lasted a bit longer than normal and headed toward the door. I was happy to have my parents stay at the house at least one more night before heading to Florida. After driving them to the airport, I returned back to the house. I walked in the front door and took a deep breath. "This is it," I said to myself. I was on my own in the house now. I turned the lights on in the kitchen and living room even though the sun was shining through the windows. It just gave me extra comfort knowing the lights were on. It was a safety blanket for me. I began to clean up from last night. Before I knew it, several hours had passed. I got a phone call from my sister. "Jay, do you want to come over for dinner? Tonight?" Sure, I don't have any plans. Sorry about Joey last night. He was still a little shaken up even when we got home. No need to apologize. I just feel bad he was so scared. He practically begged me to invite you over tonight, so I told him I would. I think he feels a little silly about what happened. "Ah, I gotcha. No worries. 7 o'clock good? Yeah, sounds like a plan. See you then." I rang the doorbell, and almost instantly the door swung open. It was Joey. He ran onto the porch and hugged me. "Uncle Jason, you're okay?" "Yeah, buddy. I'm okay, are you?" I said with a not-so-subtle fake laugh. My sister came to the door and grabbed my jacket. She hung it up and made her way towards the kitchen. "Dinner will be ready in 5 mins. Jack should be getting home from Jenny's soccer practice in a few." I took a seat at the dining room table, and I could feel Joey staring at me. Why was he so concerned? It struck me as odd, but it scared me more than anything else. What the hell did he see in that basement? What did he feel? Jack went to check. No one was down there. In all the years I lived at the house, there were no problems. Even though I ran up those stairs almost every night, nothing ever happened. I chalked it up to me just being a scared kid. "Uncle Jason, did you go in the basement last night when I left?" No, I did not. After seeing you run up those stairs, I wasn't risking it." I smiled at him nervously. "Yeah, no, I'm not scared of anything. I was just seeing what old games you had down there." I had the light on. While I was sitting looking at the shelves, someone turned out the lights. "I don't think anyone was close to the basement, buddy." I heard someone breathing. "What?" "Someone was breathing down there with me. That's when I ran to the stairs. I felt something touch my leg when I opened the door." My sister walked into the dining room with a big tray of pasta. "Food's ready." Jack walked in with Jenny, and the kids went to go wash their hands. If no one could tell I was scared before, they could sure as shit see something was wrong now. My sister asked me what's wrong, and I told her I was just starving. I ate tons of food and tried to clear my mind of what Joey told me. I asked my sister if she had any wine. I purposely drank a bit too much, which caused my sister to tell me to just spend the night on the couch, so I didn't drive home. I took her up on that offer and crashed on the couch. I didn't sleep much. It was Sunday now. I didn't want to be a burden to my sister and her family anymore, so I said goodbye and headed home. I had work tomorrow and had absolutely no clothes to wear. I had to do some laundry in that basement. I got home and gathered my clothes. I headed for the basement, making sure to hit every light switch on the way. I swung open the basement door and made sure to keep it open. I walked down the steps with my giant load of laundry and threw my clothes in the washing machine. I started it, and just as I went to turn around, I thought I heard a noise. Without hesitation, I headed for the stairs and sprinted up, skipping 4 steps with every lunge. I closed the basement door and realized that I left my phone on the table. That sound I heard was my phone vibrating. I gotta relax. When my clothes were finished washing, I put them in the dryer. When all was said and done with laundry, I brought it back upstairs without any incidents. For the next few weeks, I kept my visits to the basement at a minimum. I always had an uneasy feeling whenever I was down there. I always kept the lights on and never closed the door. Even though nothing had happened, I certainly wasn't going to take any chances. It had only been a short while my parents were in Florida, but they wanted to come back for the weekend so they could see the family. I of course told my parents that they could stay at the house. This was their house after all. We decided it would be a fun idea to have game night at the house. Game nights always consisted of good food, lots of laughs, and always, I mean always, arguments. What can I say? We were a competitive family. I grabbed my parents from the airport in the morning, and by dinner time the rest of the family was over. Joey didn't leave his parents' side from the moment he got there. He was constantly looking around and listening intently to whatever sounds he heard. We played Uno, Sorry, and Trouble, all the classics. There was one big one we hadn't played yet, Monopoly. The ultimate argument maker. I teased my sister about how I used to destroy her in Monopoly and how she still owes me money from the time she landed on Park Place and quit. After some laughing, I realized Monopoly wasn't upstairs. It was in the basement. Once I relayed the message to everyone that I had to go get it, Joey ran over to me and told me not to go. "Please, Uncle Jason, stay up here. We don't have to play Monopoly. Relax, bud. It'll take me 2 seconds. I'll be right back." "No," he shouted. "Please stay here." Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked over to us. Joey was clinging to me. My sister came over to put him at ease. I told him I wouldn't go down and it was going to be all right. Without anyone noticing, my dad made his way toward the basement door. He just wanted everyone to keep having fun. He figured he could go down, grab the game, and come back up before anyone even realized. Well, we did realize. We realized because we heard the basement door slam, and my dad tumbled down the staircase. I sprinted over to the door and had to wrestle it open. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. I finally threw it open and ran down the stairs. Monopoly money lined the basement floor. The game must have flew out of my dad's hand as he fell. He had a nasty bump on his head but insisted he was okay. I asked him what happened and he said he didn't know. I grabbed the game and was making my way back up the stairs. I just wanted everyone to keep having a good time. I got to the top of the stairs and the door slammed shut. I lost my balance and down I went. I'm fine, I swear. I helped my dad back up the stairs and sat him down at the table. My mother was worried and insisted he go to the hospital to get checked out. She didn't know if he was bleeding internally or maybe even suffered a concussion. I agreed with her and convinced my dad that he should go. As a family, we gathered our things and headed to the hospital. I figured I would need the next couple of days from work off to take care of my dad and make sure he was all right. It wasn't until we got to the hospital that I realized I left my phone back at home. I told my mom and sister that I needed to go home and grab it. Joey overheard his and pleaded to go with me. I looked at my sister and she shrugged. "Please, Uncle Jason, I just want to make sure you are safe." When we walked in the door, something seemed off. I left the lights on when we left, but now they were off. I thought maybe the power went out, but when I hit the switch, the lights came back on. I thought maybe my mom hit them on the way out. I went to grab my phone from the counter when I noticed the basement door. It was closed. I know it was open when I left because once we got my dad back upstairs and we all agreed to go to the hospital, we left soon after, and no one went back towards the basement. Curiosity got the best of me. I opened the door. Just as quickly as I opened it, Joey pushed it shut. "Joey, why did you do that? I want to see something." "There's nothing to see. You got your phone, can we please leave?" I looked at him for a brief moment and reached for the handle. I opened the door and saw the basement light was still on. I took a breath, closed my eyes for a split second, and made my way down. I don't know what I was looking for, but I was compelled to go down there. I heard Joey follow behind me down the stairs. I peered around the corner and saw nothing. Monopoly money still strewn across the floor, but nothing out of the ordinary. I hit the switch with the light still shining from the top of the stairs. "See? Nothing to worry about," I said as I turned around, proudly smiling, having conquered my fear. That's when I looked up and saw Joey standing by the door. He never came down. Whose footst? The door slammed shut, and the lights went out. That's when I heard it. The breathing. I blindly ran up the stairs, hands stretched out in front of me, reaching for that door handle. I grabbed it and pushed, but couldn't get through. Joey, let me out. Open the door. Open the fucking door. I heard footsteps sprint up the stairs and I felt someone wrap their hands around my leg. The door flew open and I slammed it behind me. I heard clawing at the base of the door and leaned with all of my weight against it. I looked over to my right and saw Joey cowering in the corner with tears pouring down. Joey, were you holding the door? Through his screaming cries, he said, "No, I told you something was down there." I grabbed Joey and we ran out of the house. When we got back to the hospital, I brought Joey to my sister and immediately called the police. They came by to investigate the empty house and found nothing in the basement. It wasn't until they came back up the stairs that they saw the claw marks on the door. Whatever was down there, can stay. I'm not. That was my last night in that house. I don't think I'll ever go back. If you're still with me, prepare yourself. The next story will test your courage. The first time Susanna's saliva dripped into my morning coffee, I didn't notice. I was too busy admiring the way the Filipino sunrise painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, too distracted by how beautiful she looked preparing breakfast on the veranda of her family's colonial home. When she kissed me on the cheek and watched me drink, her amber eyes seemed to glow with an intensity I attributed to love. I should have known something was wrong weeks before, when she first invited me to meet her family in the Philippines. 2 years of long-distance dating, and she'd only ever agreed to video chat at dawn or dusk, Manila time. The nightmare started immediately after I booked my flight. Vivid dreams of flesh tearing like wet paper, of wings unfurling from human backs, of hearts still beating in open air. I blamed travel anxiety, even when I woke up tasting copper. The village outside Quezon City was exactly as she'd described it. Lush, humid, with houses nestled between banana trees and birds of paradise. What she hadn't mentioned was the emptiness. No children playing in the streets, no neighbors chatting across fences. Even the stray dogs kept their distance from the family home, though I swore I could hear them howling at night, their cries cutting off abruptly mid-wail. Her mother, Elena, greeted me with an embrace that made my skin prickle. She held me too long, her nose tracing a line from my collar to my ear, inhaling deeply. I felt like a wine being sampled, assessed for its bouquet. "Welcome, James," she said. Her accent thick, but her English perfect. "We've heard so much about you." Behind her stood Susanna's grandmother and 2 aunts, all of them tall and elegant like my girlfriend, with the same high cheekbones and unusual amber eyes. They watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, like cats tracking a wounded bird. Later I would understand they were watching to see if the change had begun. Those first few days I noticed my sense of smell growing sharper. Every morning and evening, they prepared elaborate meals, always insisting on serving me themselves, always watching me eat with those predatory smiles. The meat had a strange, gamey flavor I couldn't place, and sometimes I could swear it was still warm, as if it had been alive moments before reaching my plate. Each bite made me feel stranger, more alert, more hungry. My gums started to ache. My back itched constantly, especially at night. When I looked in the mirror, my own eyes seemed different, darker, with flecks of amber starting to bloom in the irises. I blamed it on jet lag, on the unfamiliar food, on anything but what it really was. The house itself seemed alive at night. The locked cellar door that no one would discuss, the way the local villagers crossed themselves when we passed by, the strange, coppery smell that permeated the halls after sunset, like old pennies or fresh blood, and the sounds, God, the sounds. Wet, slithering noises in the walls, scratching above the ceiling, and sometimes what sounded like distant screaming. My new heightened senses made it all unbearable. It was on the 5th night that my own transformation began. I was following Susanna, my curiosity finally overwhelming my growing dread. The moon was full, casting everything in a sickly white light. From my window, I watched her walk into the banana grove behind the house, her white nightgown ghostly against the dark foliage. She stopped in a clearing and began to twitch. The sight should have horrified me. Instead, I felt a deep resonance, as if my own body was remembering something ancient and terrible. I watched, transfixed, as a wet, tearing sound split the night, like someone ripping apart raw chicken. Susanna's torso separated from her waist, intestines dangling like obscene ribbons, glistening in the moonlight. Wings erupted from her back in a spray of dark fluid, unfurling like some hellish butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. When she turned, her face was no longer human. Her jaw had distended, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, and her eyes glowed like hot coals in a dead fire. My own spine cracked audibly as I watched. The itching in my back had become unbearable, and I could feel something moving beneath my skin, pressing outward. I stumbled backward, knocking over a vase, and the crash brought instant silence, then the sound of wings. Susanna floated through my window, her intestines swaying gently like seaweed in a current. Behind her, 3 more figures rose into view. Her mother, grandmother, and aunt, all in the same horrific state of bifurcation. Their lower halves stood like empty clothes in the clearing, while their torsos floated on massive leathery wings. The air filled with that chittering laughter I'd been hearing in my dreams, the same sound that had been building in my own throat. "The change is already starting," she said, her voice a raspy version of its usual melody. "We've been feeding you our essence for days, in our saliva, in our food, in every kiss. We're Manananggal, Aswang, the hungry ones. It runs in the family, passed from mother to daughter, and sometimes to those we choose to keep." Through the window, I could see her family members floating in the yard, their eyes burning in the darkness. Elena called out, "The final transformation must be shared through a ritual as old as these islands. Not all survive it, of course, but Susanna thinks you're strong enough. The fact that you're still alive after drinking our essence proves it. I don't want to lose you," Susanna whispered, her inhuman face inches from mine. "And I don't want to have to kill you. Please don't make me choose. You're already halfway there, can't you feel it?" I could. My teeth were lengthening, pushing outward. The skin along my spine was splitting, and I could feel something wet and membranous trying to spread. I looked at her clawed hand, then at her face, that strange mixture of the woman I loved and something ancient and horrifying. 2 years of love and trust warred with primal terror, but then I remembered all the little things that now made sense, her strange hours, her intense protectiveness, the way she always seemed to know when danger was near, the way small animals disappeared whenever she visited me in the States. Something moved in the cellar window, a pale face pressed against the glass, mouth open in a silent scream. I thought of the missing villagers, the strange meat at dinner, the screams in the night. Yet even that knowledge didn't repulse me anymore. Instead, I felt a new hunger stirring. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice changing even as I spoke, becoming something inhuman. She smiled, revealing rows of teeth that went far too far back into her head. "Now we complete what we started. The ritual requires preparation, and I'm sure you must be very hungry by now." As she led me outside to her waiting family, my skin began to split along my waist. Had I made a terrible mistake? Or was I about to become something magnificent and terrible? Either way, as Susanna's family circled above me like vultures, their wings blotting out the stars, I realized it was far too late to change my mind. In the distance, a rooster crowed, but dawn seemed impossibly far away. Susanna's grandmother descended, carrying something that writhed in her clawed hands. The smell of fresh meat made my new teeth ache with anticipation. "Let's begin," she said, her voice thick with hunger. "And remember, dear James, try to scream quietly. We wouldn't want to wake the neighbors." though soon enough, you'll be the one doing the hunting. As they closed in around me, their shadows merging into one, I couldn't tell if the pounding I heard was my heart or drums from the village, a death knell or a celebration, perhaps both. Susanna's eyes met mine, filled with equal parts love and predatory anticipation, and I realized that sometimes love means not just accepting all parts of someone, but becoming something entirely new yourself. The transformation was already burning through my body like acid in my veins. Whether this rebirth would be my salvation or destruction remained to be seen. But as my spine began to split and wings pushed through my shoulders, I found myself smiling with teeth that were no longer my own. The air just got colder, and this next story might explain why. I'm Z, or at least that's what you'd call me. My actual name is an untranslatable sequence of vibrations, so Z will do. I'm an alienese, a real one-end last night. I made a terrible decision. I went to high school. Why? Long story short, boredom. My job was supposed to be cutting-edge research, studying Earth's organisms and ecosystems. But after a few rotations, cutting edge started to feel like cutting into my sanity. To make matters worse, my clearance gives me unrestricted access to your internet and television. And trust me, once you fall into a late-night binge of your teen dramas, you're done for. That's how I got the idea. High school seemed like the pinnacle of human experience, where all the angst, growth, and self-discovery happened. So, naturally, I had to try it. But I didn't want to observe. I wanted in. That's where Huey came. Huey is a local teenager who was unlucky enough to walk past my cloaked ship last night. He seemed like the perfect candidate. A gangly frame, shaggy hair, and a backpack stuffed with last year's crumpled homework. Typical high school. I beamed him aboard, put him into a deep stasis, don't worry, he's fine, and scanned his DNA. With the help of morphinite, a substance my species uses for scientific exploration, I took on Huey's form, right down to his favorite band t-shirt. Before you panic, know this. Huey will wake up in 24 hours, perfectly healthy. In fact, I'm giving him a bonus. I've mapped out his genetic structure and fixed everything from minor cellular damage to a potential heart condition. He'll have a clean bill of health for the next 100 years. Think of it as a thank you gift for lending me his life for a day. With Huey safely resting in my ship, I flew to the high school and parked in a remote corner of the campus at 3 a.m. The cloaking field shimmered over the hull, rendering it invisible. I stepped out, Huey's sneakers squeaking against the damp pavement, and stared up at the looming entrance. This was it. My first day of high school, and I had no idea what I was doing. That's when I realized I was super early. I guess it was just my nerves wanting to make sure everything went to plan. Can't help it, I'm an anxious alien, always trying to pre-plan, overthinking every detail. What if someone noticed the ship, even though it was cloaked? What if Huey's stasis broke? What if I forgot how to human? Since I had nothing else to do, I decided to sneak inside. The school was dark and eerily quiet, the faint smell of industrial cleaners lingering in the air. I slipped into the bathroom closest to the main entrance, locked myself in a stall, and waited. When the bell finally rang, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. My first class was physics. I double-checked the schedule I'd memorized from the school's website and headed to the room, doing my best to blend in with the flow of students. It was all going fine until I walked in. The teacher wasn't who I'd researched. Instead of the bespectacled middle-aged woman I'd seen in staff photos, there was a massive substitute at the front of the room. He had to be at least 6'5", bald, and almost entirely hairless, save for faint stubble around his jawline. He was dressed sharply, but his movements were unsettlingly precise. His posture rigid. The air around him practically screamed danger. I froze. I knew exactly what he was. We call them the Wardens. Humans call them Men in Black. Whatever the name, their purpose is the same. Hunt down rogue aliens who interfere with human society. They're not government agents, not exactly. They're part of a shadowy partnership between humans and my species, a cooperation designed to maintain order. My stomach, or the human equivalent, lurched. He wasn't just a substitute, he was here for me. "All right," he said, his voice deep and cold as vacuum space. "Your teacher couldn't make it today. I'm Mr. Ward. Now, let's start with introduction. 3 things about you: name, where you're from, and something you're interested in." My brain short-circuited. I barely heard the first few students. I ran through every possible scenario, analyzing how I could mess this up. Then, too quickly, it was my turn. I stood awkwardly, my borrowed human limbs suddenly too long and too heavy. I'm Huey," I stammered. My voice cracked. "Perfect. I'm from far away." My hands were sweat. "I like quantum physics and, toaster strudel." The entire class turned to look at the warden's steely gaze locked onto me, unblinking. I braced myself for the moment he'd blow my cover. But then, "Okay," he said, clearly thrown off by my weird energy. He gestured to the next student. "You." The warden moved on, but I could feel him studying me out of the corner of his eye. Then, something wild happened. He zeroed in on an unsuspecting kid in the second row. "You," he barked, pointing at a scrawny boy. "What's your favorite celestial?" The kid blinked. What about it? Be specific." The kid looked around, his voice shaking. It's round." The class burst into laughter. "Interesting," Mr. Ward said, narrowing his eyes. "Do you prefer daytime or nighttime?" "Daytime?" the kid answered, his voice cracked. "Why?" "Because the sun's out." More laughter. Students started whispering to each other, and I could see the tension break. Whatever the warden was looking for, he wasn't finding it. For now, I was safe, but I could feel his eyes flicking back to me every now and then. This was far from over. The terror doesn't end here. The next story will make your heart race even faster. I settled myself on the huge, neon, bouncy gym ball, tightened my core muscles, and moved my legs. I was still panting, dripping with sweat from my session on the elliptical. I turned to the mirror to check my form, and out of nowhere, a large girl dressed in pink and taupe gym gear barged into the ball, like a bear. I can't quite describe how she just appeared and bodied me. "Hey," I cried, angry and confused, struggling to regain my balance on the ball while pushing her away. I couldn't feel anything. I looked around for the girl who had barreled into me. No one was close. Everybody was focused on their machine and their movements and their music playing right into their ear. I looked back in the mirror. A large girl, wearing a tight pink top with the word "beautiful" printed in darker pink chubby curvy letters right across her boob shelf, stared back at me. I stared. And then my anger and confusion slowly gave way to trickling fear as I noticed that her eyes were too black, her mouth too black, gaping holes of misery and rage. We both spoke at the same time. "You can see." "Why did you push?" Even as she spoke, the vision flitted and faded in the mirror. I could feel my heart rate slowing down to normal. I looked again. There was no one in the mirror. But now that I knew she was there, I could sense her standing next to me. Her sweaty, bulging, uncomfortable presence radiating discomfort. Then she moved away. I turned, following her presence with my eyes, and I spotted a young fellow on the press bench lifting more than what seemed like a safe weight. I knew she was heading over to it. "No! Stop!" I cried out, reaching out in a futile motion. Too late. The weight smashed down as a howl of agony rose, penetrating through all earbuds and headphones, and ceasing all movement in the gym. They told us to leave before the paramedics arrived. All night I dreamed of the large ghost in the gym, causing havoc and injury. Had she died there? How? Against my better judgment, I went back the next day. I did the same routine, the elliptical getting me sweating and flushed, and went over to the mirror in front of the huge, bouncy gym ball. One of them seemed deflated, sagging sideways, and I felt the rush of fear in me again. She was there. In the mirror, I could see her sitting on the deflated ball, squishing it under her. She was wearing the same tight pink top. "Beautiful." "Please stop," I said, realizing I sounded ridiculous. She shrugged, turning to look at my image in the mirror with those black pools of eye. The first thing I realized after I died was that I'm still fat. My breath slowed back to normal. Her mirror image was fading. Not knowing what else to do, I sat on a bright orange gym ball next to her. "Have you tried this?" I tightened my abs and stretched. "It feels so good." The ball next to me, she was seated on changed shape, and I knew she was copying me. "If you let people be, I'll train with you every day. It's much more fun with a gym buddy," I said. "Promise." I felt her grip my mind. But the fear was ebbing. "I promise. Just when you thought it was safe to breathe, this next tale will take your breath away." In 2007, a group of Japanese scientists discovered a way of growing new teeth in adult mice by transplanting into them lab-grown tooth germs, derived from materials extracted from other younger mice. These new teeth were fully functional and indistinguishable from the old ones, and the results were welcomed by doctors in the field of regenerative medicine. However, as with many results of experiments performed on animals, the question was, would the same method work on humans? Officially, no attempts to replicate the experiment on humans were made, given the ethical intricacies involved. Unofficially, several experiments were conducted and failed. Further testing was suspended. Several years ago, another group of Japanese scientists, with strong ties to the first, published the results of a similar experiment. This time, instead of extracting biological material from one specimen, growing it externally and transplanting the result into a second specimen, the scientists discovered they could promote tooth growth in a single mouse by using a drug to suppress a certain protein in that mouse. This method was cheaper, quicker, and simpler, and it avoided many of the ethical issues which had prevented the earlier method from being officially tested on humans. Consequently, the lead scientist of the Japanese group, Dr. Ochimori, partnered with an American university, received funding from both the U.S. and Japanese governments, and assembled a team to test the ability of the protein-suppressing drug to promote tooth growth in human beings. My mentor, Dr. Khan, was chosen to co-lead the testing, and Dr. Khan chose me to help him. In total, there were 6 people involved in the human trial. Dr. Ochimori, Dr. Khan, me, 2 Japanese scientists chosen by Ochimori, and the test subject, whom I knew only as Kenji. Of these 6 people, I am the only survivor, although, as you will come to understand, the term survivor is itself problematic, and in a sense there no longer exist any survivors of the trial, not even you. I do want to make clear here that there was no issue with consent. Kenji agreed to take part. He was a willing participant. My first impressions of Kenji were that he was a polite and humble middle-aged man whose dental problems had caused significant problems in his life, including the breakdown of his marriage and his inability to progress professionally. He was, therefore, a relatively sad individual. However, he exhibited high intelligence and was easy to work with because he understood biology, anatomy, and the foundations of what we were attempting. Hence, he was, in some sense, both the subject of the experiment and an unofficial part of the team conducting it, effectively testing upon himself. While I admit that this is unusual and in most cases improper, no one voiced any concerns until such concerns were no longer relevant. The trial began with a small single dose of the protein-suppressing drug injected once per day. The effects were disappointing. While the drug did somewhat inhibit the creation of the requisite protein, this did not lead to any tooth growth, and it did not replicate the results Dr. Ochimori had achieved with mice, in which even minor protein suppression had led to minor tooth growth. Dr. Ochimori and Dr. Khan therefore decided to increase the dosage, and when that did not create the desired result, also the frequency. It was when Kenji started receiving 4 relatively high-dose drug injections per day that something finally happened. The first new teeth formed, and they began to penetrate his gum. But this came with a cost. The pain which Kenji endured both during the formation and eruption phases of the dental regeneration was much more intense than any of us had anticipated. In mice, the tooth growth had been generally painless, no different than when their old teeth had grown naturally. What Kenji experienced was magnitudes more painful than what he had experienced when his adult teeth had grown in, and we could not explain why. At this point, with Kenji screaming for hours in the observation room, Dr. Khan suggested stopping the trial. Dr. Okimori disagreed. When we held a vote, all 3 Japanese members of the team voted to continue the trial, so that Dr. Khan and I were outnumbered 3,002. What was most interesting, however, was that Kenji himself did not want to stop the trial. Despite his pain, which to me seemed unbearable, I could not listen to his screams, let alone imagine the suffering which caused them. He maintained that he wanted to continue. Thus, we continued. Within 3 days of the implementation of the more intensive drug injection schedule, all of Kenji's missing teeth had grown in. This was, from a purely medical standpoint, utterly remarkable. But it rendered the trial a success only if you discounted Kenji's pain. It was not feasible, Dr. Khan argued, to report such results because one could not market a drug that caused unexplainable suffering. Dr. Ochimori disagreed, arguing that the cause of the suffering, which he deemed a side effect, need not be understood for the results to be worthwhile. He pointed out that many drugs have side effects we know about, without understanding the exact biochemical mechanisms behind them. As long as the existence of the pain is not hidden, he argued, the results are beneficial, and anyone who agrees to further testing, or potentially to the resulting treatment itself, does so fully informed, and of his own free will. Dr. Khan cited ethics concerns. Dr. Okimori accused him of medical paternalism. It was in the hours during which these oft-heated discussions took place that we missed a troubling development. While it was true that in 3 days Kenji's missing teeth had all been regenerated and were functionally indistinguishable from his old teeth, this indistinguishability was temporary. For, while regular adult teeth grow to a certain size and stop, the regenerated teeth had not stopped growing. They were the same size as Kenji's old teeth, only for a brief period. Then they outgrew them, first by a small amount, but steadily, by more and more, until they were twice then 3 times 4 times 5 their size. They were more like tusks than teeth, fang-shaped columns of dental matter erupting endlessly from his profusely bleeding gums, until even closing his mouth had become, for Kenji, impossible, and the strain this placed on his jaws bordered on the extreme. We had already cut the drug injections, of course. Or so we thought, because we soon discovered that even when we thought we knew how much of the drug Kenji was receiving, Kenji was injecting himself secretly with significantly more. This, more than anything else, drove Dr. Ochimori to despair, because he knew it invalidated the results of the trial. At this point, Dr. Khan decided to forcibly confine Kenji and perform emergency surgery on him to remove the inhumanly growing teeth. I agreed, but the 2 Japanese scientists did not, and they instead confined Dr. Khan and myself to one of the unused observation rooms. We pleaded with them to let us out, more importantly, to help Kenji, but they ignored us. For hours we sat together silently, listened to the crying, howling, growls, and crunching that emanated from somewhere in the facility, each of us imagining on his own what must have been going on. Once, through the reinforced glass window of the observation room door, I saw Kenji, if one can still refer to him as that, run past, and the impression left upon me was one of a deformed elephant, a sate with teeth that had curved and grown into through his head, his brain, his self, his humanity, and exploded outwards from the interior of his skull. And then, hours later, the doors unlocked. We stepped out. I am not ashamed to admit that in the wordless silence, I reached for Dr. Khan's hand and he took it, and hand in hand we proceeded down the hall. My own instinct was to flee, but I knew that Dr. Khan's was the same as it had always been, to help his patient, and he led me away from the facility doors, towards the room in which Kenji had been tested on. We came, first, upon the body of one of the 2 Japanese scientists, dead, pierced and torn apart, his hand still held, now grotesquely, a handgun. His eyes had been pushed into their sockets, and a bloody document folder placed upon his chest. Khan picked it up, thumbed through it, and passed it to me. Inside was the scientist's true identity. He was not a Japanese scientist, but a member of the NIAC, the Japanese intelligence agency. I put the folder back on his chest, and we continued forward. The facility had been visibly Doors were dented. Some of the lights were off or flickering. We heard then a sound, as if a deep rumbling. Dr. Khan motioned for me to stop. We had rounded a corner and were at the beginning of a long corridor. At the other end, into a kind of gloom, rolled suddenly what I can describe only as an ossified half-human ball, except that I knew it could not be made of bone because teeth are not bone, and this ball was constructed of a spherical latticework of long, thin, white teeth, somewhere in the midst of which was Kenji's body. It appeared to me only as a contained darkness. The teeth, I noted, seemed to originate no longer solely in his mouth, but from everywhere on his body, although given the complexity of the spiraling, winding, penetrating network of fangs, which had pierced his body innumerable times, it was impossible to state with certainty where any one tooth began, or what the resulting creature even was. Surely Kenji the man must be dead, I thought, but this new thing was alive. "Kenji," Dr. Khan said, "I can help." And the ball started rolling. Dr. Khan smiled warmly, but the ball, although slow at first, began to pick up speed, and soon was rushing towards us with such velocity that I leapt to the side and plastered my back against the wall. You may call it cowardice, but to me it was the instinct of self-preservation, an instinct Dr. Khan either did not share or had overcome, because I hadn't even have the time to yell his name before Kenji the sphere crashed into him, impaling him on a myriad of spear-like teeth, and continuing into and through the wall at the head of the corridor, one man impaled on the other, and with each sickening rotation, Dr. Khan's body was pulverized further into human sludge. I realized I had been holding my breath and let it out, gasped for air. I screamed. Then I set out after them, following, for reasons I still cannot explain, the unhindered destruction and viscous trail of flesh. A few minutes later I found myself having entered a dark conference room, in the corner of which sat Dr. Ochimori slouched against the walls. He was holding a long knife with which he had just finished disemboweling himself. His spilled innards still steamed, and his eyes, although moving slowly, set their gaze firmly upon me, and in slow, slurred speech he said, "End yourself now, before you too become of him." He died with a cold, rational grimace on his face that left his small, yellowed teeth exposed, dripping with pinkish blood. And here, I think now, was the last true human. Determined to follow the path of death to its very end, I stepped through a broken-down wall into some kind of office in which Kenji the sphere had come to rest. A few parts of Dr. Khan were still stuck to the exterior of his dental shell, but the shell itself was now completed, solid. I could no longer see between the individual teeth to the darkness that was Kenji inside. Speaking seemed foolish, so I said nothing. I simply watched, listening to the groaning and grinding sounds that filled the room, as Kenji's teeth, having melded together into one surface, continued to grow, to push one against each other in the absence of empty space and then to crack. Audibly first, then visibly. The first fracture appearing at the top of the sphere, before following a jagged line downwards, until the rift was completed and the shell fragments fell away, revealing a single already expanding unity that I could note in the brief moment when its entirety was before me, before it expanded forever beyond the pathetic, human scope of my visual comprehension failed to comprehend. From 1,000 textbooks, through 1,000 microscopes, I knew it. It was life, a cell, a solitary cell, growing fantastically. In the blink of an eye, it absorbed the room, and me, and the facility, and you, and the solar system, and the universe. We have all become of the cell. We used to ask, what is the universe? We must now ask, of what is the cell which contains the universe? In a way, nothing has changed. Your life goes on as usual. You probably didn't even feel it. Or, if you did, your mind imagined some prosaic explanation. Perhaps it doesn't even matter, living versus living within a cell. But I believe that a part of us knows we are irretrievably separated from the past. Those who died before and those who die after share different fates. Looking at the fragments of Kenji's emptied shell, I felt awe and sadness and nostalgia. We used to look at the stars and feel terror, wondering if there was any meaning to our existence. How comforting such non-meaningful existence now seems. Once, I was afraid that I did not have a purpose in life. I tried to find it in my relationships, myself, my work. Now, I feel revulsion at the thought that I am trapped in a biological machine whose workings I do not understand, and whose purpose we cannot escape. Some fears fade, but others linger. Let's dive into a story that lingers long after it ends. So this has been one of the scariest experiences of my life. Perhaps even another example of the butterfly effect. I am a senior graphic designer, and recently needed a change within my field. I began studying UX design and applying for positions even as junior just to gain some experience. I came across a post. It was an official job listing for a UX graphic designer, and it was also not too far from where I live. I applied for the job and maybe 15 others. Within the week, I received 2 interviews, including the listing above. I put on my formal black pencil skirt, white shirt, red heels, and slapped on some stark red lipstick like always. There was a huge sign outside a double-story run-down house. It read, EA Designs. It included a professionally designed logo. I don't mind working in a building that looks like a house from the outside, but as I got inside, it looked like an unkept old-age home. There was even a dark playroom on the right as you entered. It had a ball pit and some other kids' facilities, but there was no light except for the light from the passage and the open front door. A middle-aged Caucasian lady appeared before me. She asked, "Are you Zed?" I slightly nodded yes, not moving or blinking as she closed the door behind me. Still skeptic of my surroundings, I quickly snapped out of it and pulled out my hand. "Yes, it's nice to meet you," I said confidently. She said, "Right this way. The office is at the back." I followed slowly, gleaming through each room as we passed. It was mostly empty rooms, just rusted walls and no visible windows or air. It smelled dusty. My spider senses were on overdrive, but the dumb, naive me continued along the passage. At the back was a medium to small-sized room. There was a huge, almost office, dining room-looking table in the center. At the left-hand corner, there was an elderly lady writing on some paper. She did not even raise her head to look at me. And sitting not too far from her was a young Caucasian girl who seemed to be in her early 20s with long blonde hair. "Oh, hey, you must be Zed," she said in a cheerful voice. I smiled politely and responded yes, and you are? "Sam, web developer." "Yeesh," she exclaimed. "I know this place looks like a dump, but we don't get walk-in clients as we mainly offer an online service. And we just moved here, so hopefully we will be doing some interior design soon." Her words put me at ease, and I felt like a jerk for being judgmental, although it was quite an unprofessional setting, and the table was filled with papers in stacks, almost covering the entire table, which, again I might add, is huge. The interview proceeded as usual, and the next day they called to say I had gotten the position. The package was quite impressive, too. I mean, it was a lot of money being offered, but I didn't think too much of it because there are some senior designers in the field that earn that well. I accepted, perhaps because of the large offer, but also because it didn't seem all that bad after the interview. I was to start the following day, which was a Wednesday. I got there early and was greeted by the same middle-aged lady. At the back, Sam had been waiting for me. She pulled up a chair next to her. The table was still covered in papers, and there was not a single spot for me to sit my laptop down. I sat there quietly for about a few moments. I had suddenly seen something running across the room. It was probably a rat. I jumped to my feet, knocking down a stack of papers at the edge of the table. The table became visible, exposing a section filled with holes, scratches, and what looked like dried blood. Blood rushed down to my feet, and my heart almost fell out of my mouth as I began having an internal attack. I said, "Oh no, was that a rat? I hate rats." I have some rat poison in my car. I'll be right back." I left my laptop behind and walked as if nothing was wrong. As soon as I reached my car, I booked it. I didn't even blink or look back. I sped back home. I contemplated going back for my laptop and just quitting officially. But something in me didn't even want to move off the couch I had been seated in for almost 2 hours. A few days later, there was a spur of outroar on the news. A body of a young boy in his 20s had been found in an abandoned house. He was identified and images of him were being displayed on the news. The house he had been found at had flashed on the screen. It was the same house. I felt queasy and lightheaded. I remembered having left my laptop there and thought the police might suspect me, but no evidence was found at the site. I tried to find him on Facebook and Google. I finally found him online and read through his profile. My fingers finally stopped scrolling when I read, "Studied, graphic design." Had it not been for the rat, I would not have knocked over the papers. Left and the graphic designer on the news would have definitely been me. The night is far from over, and the next story proves it. It was supposed to be a fun day visiting a Christmas village. Just the 5 of us, co-workers and the best of friends, out for a good time during the holidays. Maybe it would have been, but how were we supposed to know the festive house with all the lights and snow wasn't Santa's workshop? Isn't this wonderful? Clarissa, my wife, said as we entered the Christmas village. It really was. An open field just outside of town had been converted into a sprawling replica of the North Pole. The buildings were designed to look like quaint cottages and shops, complete with themes of toys and candy. Colored lights were draped everywhere, making the entire village sparkle and twinkle like a starburst of colors. Actors dressed up like Santa's helpers wandered about, playing roles, interacting with the customers, and hawking various souvenirs. There was even a petting zoo with reindeer, and an actual sleigh with 9 reindeer hooked up, ready to take it on a tour through town for one of the scheduled candy parades. Finally, there was Santa himself, sitting on a throne atop a hill, surrounded by decorated pine trees and brightly wrapped packages, greeting people and taking pictures with them. How then could such a wonderful place harbor something so terrible as that house? Most of the day was wonderful. It was crisp Saturday, and we had been planning this outing as a group all week. It was a pure delight being part of the fun as my wife and friends excitedly toured the village. We did everything there was to do that day. We shopped in every store. We snacked in every restaurant and food stand. We played every game. We drank every warm, seasonal, boozy beverage there was. We pet the reindeer. We took pictures with Santa. We role-played with the actors and generally goofed off. It was a magical day. And then we found the workshop. "What's that?" Joel asked curiously, pointing down a narrow, unused side street. "Let's find out," Carol said, laughing and smiling. "Whatever it is, I bet it's fun." We all cheerily went along with her suggestion, singing Christmas carols as we made our tipsy way to the mystery place. What we saw when we got there was the most magical thing we had seen all day. "They really went all out here," John exclaimed excitedly. "I can hardly believe it. They even got real little people to play the elves." I looked again. Sure enough, all of the actors playing the elves were unusually short. There couldn't have been one of them over 4 feet tall. They were busily working, rushing about like they were preparing for something big. "Unreal," I said, and noticed my breath fog in front of me. Clarissa hugged her arms around herself. "It's cold here. Why don't we go inside Santa's workshop? I bet it's fun." The workshop looked exactly as one might imagine Santa's workshop to be. Red, white, green, silver, and gold were the colors. The architecture looked very 15th century, giving it a quaint appearance. There were snowmen, small pine trees, and big candy canes scattered around the grounds. A warm light glowed inside, gently filtering out of the windows, and a thick curl of white smoke rose from the chimney like a serpentine cloud. All of us were feeling the cold. The crisp air seemed to have taken a sudden plunge, and it only made the warm, festive building all the more appealing. We happily agreed that it looked like fun, and walked to it. The elves mostly seemed not to notice us as they rushed about their work, but I noticed one give us a stern look and a shake of his head, and he rushed on by. Something about him seemed off, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what. "Hurry!" John called as I paused to consider the strange behavior by this small man. I caught up as everyone reached the door. Joel opened it and held it open as we all filed in. Inside it was bright and warm. Not painfully bright like an office with too much overhead lighting, but comfortably bright, like an open field on an early spring day. It smelled of sugar and baked goods. The entry was an open room, festively decorated with a reception and a door that led inside. Behind the desk was a small man dressed as an elf. He smiled at us and waved us over. "Before you enter the workshop, you need to sign the registry," he said in cheerful tone. "What's inside?" Carol asked curiously, eyeing the door behind the elf. The little man smiled widely. "It's a place like no other," he said brightly, "where the wonders never cease, and everyone gets what they deserve." "Well, I deserve $1 million, Joel said with a laugh. "Let's sign this book and get on in there." We were all there for a good time. We'd been having a good time. So how could we possibly know, how could we have any reason to expect, that by signing that guest book, our wonderful day would become the stuff of nightmares? We happily signed our pages on lines at the bottom of individual pages. Most of each page was covered in ornate calligraphy, so fancy that none of us could actually read it. At the bottom was a heavy line with an X in front of it, indicating that it was where we should sign. The paper felt like old vellum, and the pen was a proper fountain pen that ink flowed out of in a dark line that varied in thickness with every stroke. Something wasn't sitting quite right in my mind. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a general sense that all was not as it seemed. "What's this say?" I asked as I was signing my name. "Standard release," the elf said in a tone that indicated it didn't matter. "You know how these lawyers are, making everything into a liability." I laughed at this, as did my wife and John. Joel gave Clarissa a mock look of alarm, and she joined in the laughter. As soon as the last of us finished signing, the door opened, and we could see inside. The ladies gasped, and the men's eyes grew wide in wonder. I wish I had the words to properly describe what we saw as we looked through that door, but it was everything any of us could have thought, hoped, and expected Santa's workshop to be. It was filled with toys, elves busily crafting them as they chatted cheerfully, laughed, and sang. That's when I noticed what had seemed off to me before. "Guys," I said hesitantly, "these dwarfs are proportioned like a full-size person, just shorter." "Good for them," John said dismissively. "Now let's get in there and enjoy the best workshop setup I've ever seen." I didn't share my friend's lack of concern. Normally, a person with dwarfism is not proportional to a full-sized person. Their heads are large compared to their bodies. Their limbs are short compared to their bodies, too. These actors were more like pygmies, people who do not suffer from dwarfism but are still extraordinarily short. It's incredibly rare, and there was no way this seasonal fair should have been able to find so many. The elves and the rest of the village are full-sized people. These people are all pygmies, I said with concern. "Something's—" "In we go," my wife interrupted, and she pushed me through the door with everyone else following. At first, everything was fine. At first, everything was exactly as it had seemed from the other room. That is, until a new figure entered the room. "Look!" Carol squealed with excitement. "It's Santa!" And at first it seemed to be. In walked a large man dressed in an old-fashioned Santa outfit, green and brown, the kind he was best known for before the Coke Company popularized the red variant. He was a large man, with a thick, long white beard flowing out from under his hood. He carried a large sack over one shoulder, and in his other hand he held a shining scroll. His face was hidden in the shadow of his hood, with only his beard, and the tip a long, pointed nose poking out. "Welcome," he said in a deep, booming voice. "It is time to check your signatures against the list and see if you're naughty or nice." Everyone but me oohed and awed in delighted anticipation. It was the nose. His nose wasn't right. Wasn't Santa's nose supposed to be like a button, not long and thin? I shook my head to clear the thought away. It's not the real Santa, I muttered under my breath. Get over it. I convinced myself that it was just the actor. I couldn't expect every Santa actor to actually look perfectly like the mythical version of Saint Nick after all. It was a silly notion, an unreasonable expectation. And yet, this didn't feel like the fun fakery of the village outside. And just why was the biggest, most effortful, most important part of the Who Christmas village tucked away from everything else, hidden down a narrow side street where anyone could miss it? Why wasn't it the literal center of town? These thoughts raged through my skull, and I wanted to voice them. But I tamped down the urge, telling myself that I was just being silly, that this strange paranoia was unfounded with no relation to reality. Joel Donaldson, Santa announced in that booming voice. Yours is the first name signed. Time to see if you're naughty or nice. Joel stepped forward with a comical flourish. I noticed that his face was radiant with a blend of happiness and just a little bit too much alcohol consumed in our day of revels. I'm ready for my present, he announced with all the innocence and expectation of someone who truly thought that was right in the world. You will get your just reward, Santa declared somberly. He held up the scroll in front of him and let it unfurl. He read it aloud. Joel Donaldson, you are on the naughty list. Oh, Joel said mockingly with a smile and a wave of his hands. The elves all stopped working and began to gather around us. They sang, Naughty list, you are on the naughty list, over and over again as they surrounded Joel. Big, truly joyful smiles plastered across their smooth faces. Santa stepped aside, revealing a chair that had not been there before. Come, he commanded. Receive your reward. The elves crowded in around Joel and began pushing him forward toward the chair. Naughty list, you are on the naughty list, they continued to sing. Joel laughed and went along with it, believing that nothing was out of place. And it was all just part of the show. He walked past Santa and plopped himself down in the chair. That was the moment when the truth of our situation revealed itself. Heavy spiked leather straps erupted out of the chair and wrapped themselves around Joel, trapping him and pining him down. They squeezed and tightened around his legs and torso, and pinpricks of blood began to stain his clothing in slowly spreading circles of red. He screamed in surprise and pain. What are you doing to me? He yelled, pain cracking his voice as he thrashed his head and swatted futilely at the straps binding him to the chair. The elves laughed musically and began to chant. Ochimori slouched against the walls. He was holding a long knife with which he had just finished disemboweling himself. His spilled innards still steamed, and his eyes, although moving slowly, set their gaze firmly upon me. And in slow, slurred speech he said, End yourself now, before you too become of him. He died with a cold, rational grimace on his face that left his small, yellowed teeth exposed, dripping with pinkish blood. And here, I think now, was the last true human. Determined to follow the path of death to its very end, I stepped through a broken-down wall into some kind of office in which Kenji the Sphere had come to rest. A few parts of Doc Khan were still stuck to the exterior of his dental shell, but the shell itself was now completed, solid. I could no longer see between the individual teeth to the darkness that was Kenji inside. Speaking seemed foolish, so I said nothing. I simply watched, listening to the groaning and grinding sounds that filled the room, as Kenji's teeth, having melded together into one surface, continued to grow, to push one against each other in the absence of empty space and, then to crack. Audibly first, then visibly. The first fracture appearing at the top of the sphere, before following a jagged line downwards, until the rift was completed and the shell fragments fell away, revealing a single already expanding unity. that I could notify in the brief moment when its entirety was before me, before it expanded forever beyond the pathetic, human scope of my visual comprehension failed to comprehend. From 1,000 textbooks, through 1,000 microscopes, I knew it. It was life, a cell, a solitary cell, growing fantastically. In the blink of an eye, it absorbed the room, and me, and the facility, and you, and the solar system, and the universe. We have all become of the cell. We used to ask, what is the universe? We must now ask, of what is the cell which contains the universe? In a way, nothing has changed. Your life goes on as usual. You probably didn't even feel it. Or, if you did, your mind imagined some prosaic explanation. Perhaps it doesn't even matter, living versus living within a cell. But I believe that a part of us knows we are irretrievably separated from the past. Those who died before and those who die after share different fates. Looking at the fragments of Kenji's emptied shell, I felt awe and sadness and nostalgia. We used to look at the stars and feel terror, wondering if there was any meaning to our existence. How comforting such non-meaningful existence now seems. Once, I was afraid that I did not have a purpose in life. I tried to find it in my relationships, myself, my work. Now, I feel revulsion at the thought that I am trapped in a biological machine whose workings I do not understand, and whose purpose we cannot escape. Some fears fade, but others linger. Let's dive into a story that lingers long after it ends. So this has been one of the scariest experiences of my life. Perhaps even another example of the butterfly effect. I am a senior graphic designer, and recently needed a change within my field. I began studying UX design and applying for positions even as junior just to gain some experience. I came across a post. It was an official job listing for a UX graphic designer, and it was also not too far from where I live. I applied for the job and maybe 15 others. Within the week, I received 2 interviews, including the listing above. I put on my formal black pencil skirt, white shirt, red heels, and slapped on some stark red lipstick like always. There was a huge sign outside a double-story run-down house. It read, EA Designs. It included a professionally designed logo. I don't mind working in a building that looks like a house from the outside, but as I got inside, it looked like an unkept old-age home. There was even a dark playroom on the right as you entered. It had a ball pit and some other kids' facilities, but there was no light except for the light from the passage and the open front door. A middle-aged Caucasian lady appeared before me. She asked, "Are you Zed?" I slightly nodded yes, not moving or blinking as she closed the door behind me. Still skeptic of my surroundings, I quickly snapped out of it and pulled out my hand. "Yes, it's nice to meet you," I said confidently. She said, "Right this way. The office is at the back." I followed slowly, gleaming through each room as we passed. It was mostly empty rooms, just rusted walls and no visible windows or air. It smelled dusty. My spider senses were on overdrive, but the dumb naive me continued along the passage. At the back was a medium to small-sized room. There was a huge, almost office, dining room-looking table in the center. At the left-hand corner, there was an elderly lady writing on some paper. She did not even raise her head to look at me, and sitting not too far from her was a young Caucasian girl, who seemed to be in her early 20s with long blonde hair. "Oh, hey, you must be Zed," she said in a cheerful voice. I smiled politely and responded yes, and you are? "Sam, web developer." "Yeesh," she exclaimed. "I know this place looks like a dump, but we don't get walk-in clients as we mainly offer an online service, and we just moved here, so hopefully we will be doing some interior design soon." Her words put me at ease, and I felt like a jerk for being judgmental, although it was quite an unprofessional setting, and the table was filled with papers in stacks, almost covering the entire table, which, again I might add, is huge. The interview proceeded as usual, and the next day they called to say I had gotten the position. The package was quite impressive, too. I mean, it was a lot of money being offered, but I didn't think too much of it because There are some senior designers in the field that earn that well. I accepted, perhaps because of the large offer, but also because it didn't seem all that bad after the interview. I was to start the following day, which was a Wednesday. I got there early and was greeted by the same middle-aged lady. At the back, Sam had been waiting for me. She pulled up a chair next to her. The table was still covered in papers, and there was not a single spot for me to sit my laptop down. I sat there quietly for about a few moments. I had suddenly seen something running across the room. It was probably a rat. I jumped to my feet, knocking down a stack of papers at the edge of the table. The table became visible, exposing a section filled with holes, scratches, and what looked like dried blood. Blood rushed down to my feet, and my heart almost fell out of my mouth as I began having an internal attack. I said, "Oh no, was that a rat? I hate rats. I have some rat poison in my car. I'll be right back." I left my laptop behind and walked as if nothing was wrong. As soon as I reached my car, I booked it. I didn't even blink or look back. I sped back home. I contemplated going back for my laptop and just quitting officially. But something in me didn't even want to move off the couch I had been seated in for almost 2 hours. A few days later, there was a spur of outroar on the news. A body of a young boy in his 20s had been found in an abandoned house. He was identified, and images of him were being displayed on the news. The house he had been found at had flashed on the screen. It was the same house. I felt queasy and lightheaded. I remembered having left my laptop there and thought the police might suspect me, but no evidence was found at the site. I tried to find him on Facebook and Google. I finally found him online and read through his profile. My fingers finally stopped scrolling when I read, "Studied graphic design." Had it not been for the rat, I would not have knocked over the papers. Left, and the graphic designer on the news would have definitely been me. The night is far from over, and the next story proves it. It was supposed to be a fun day visiting a Christmas village. Just the 5 of us, co-workers and the best of friends, out for a good time during the holidays. Maybe it would have been, but how were we supposed to know the festive house with all the lights and snow wasn't Santa's workshop? Isn't this wonderful? Clarissa, my wife, said as we entered the Christmas village. It really was. An open field just outside of town had been converted into a sprawling replica of the North Pole. The buildings were designed to look like quaint cottages and shops, complete with themes of toys and candy. Colored lights were draped everywhere, making the entire village sparkle and twinkle like a starburst of colors. Actors dressed up like Santa's helpers wandered about, playing roles, interacting with the customers, and hawking various souvenirs. There was even a petting zoo with reindeer, and an actual sleigh with 9 reindeer hooked up, ready to take it on a tour through town for one of the scheduled candy parades. Finally, there was Santa himself, sitting on a throne atop a hill, surrounded by decorated pine trees and brightly wrapped packages, greeting people and taking pictures with them. How then could such a wonderful place harbor something so terrible as that house? Most of the day was wonderful. It was crisp Saturday, and we had been planning this outing as a group all week. It was a pure delight being part of the fun as my wife and friends excitedly toured the village. We did everything there was to do that day. We shopped in every store. John yelled in protest about how they couldn't do this to us. I was silent. None of it mattered anyway. We were trapped, well and truly, and no amount of protest, no flood of tears would change it. We neared the door and were roughly shoved the last few steps. The door slammed shut as soon as we were through, leaving us enveloped in darkness. We waited in silence for a few moments. The darkness was oppressive, and my anxiety climbed with every second. It could be hiding literally anything, and based on the horrors of the last 2 rooms, that anything was certain to be deeply disturbing at best and outright horrifying at worst. Hello? I called out to the darkness in a shuddering breath. As if in response, there was a slow, grinding sound as part of the wall dropped down, revealing a roaring fireplace. The inferno lit the room in a dancing, ominous glow. It might have been a comforting glow under other circumstances, but after the previous 2 rooms, there was nothing it could be but a sign of foreboding. In the center of a room was a large wrought iron framed bed with chains at the head and foot. In place of a mattress was an iron slab. Beyond that, the room lay barren, empty of all signs of life or habitation. The fire blazed even higher and belched out into the room, licking the bed frame for just a moment, like the tongue of some arcane, hungry beast. As the fire retreated, a now familiar, horrifying figure stepped out of the flames, followed by an entourage of those despicable elves. Without any further fanfare, Krampus held out his scroll and dropped the bottom roll. "John Valentine," he announced in that booming voice, "you are on the naughty list." The elves were on him in an instant, singing that horrible chant, "Naughty list, naughty list, you are on the naughty list," as they grabbed him and lifted him overhead, kicking and screaming. It was futile. Small as they were, the elves' grip was like iron, and all John could accomplish was wrenching his own back and shoulders, painfully, as they proceeded to the bed. The elves chained him to the bed. Iron manacles locked tight around his wrists and ankles. Then they pulled the chains taut to splay him out and immobilize him. He screamed in pain and terror as his shoulders and hips were dislocated with a series of loud pops. "You are guilty of adultery many, many times," Krampus announced with malicious glee. "You lied to cover it up. You betrayed someone close to you, exploited his trust, and smiled as you deceived a friend." John was screaming in protest. "It's not like that," he protested. "We're in love. You can't blame me for being in love. Love is a beautiful thing." Krampus laughed wickedly. "You continue to lie even as you face just punishment for your crimes," he declared with absolute authority. "You never loved her. You had other women even as you took what didn't belong to you, over and over and over again." I was stunned. The John I knew would never do something so heinous. He was a good, upright man, and the only one I trusted completely. I turned to my wife in shock. "Who did he?" My words caught in my throat as I saw my wife, my dear Clarissa, crying, her mouth quivering with great sobs, and tears flowing like twin rivers from her bright green eyes. Her head hung in shame. "He said he loved me," she sobbed. "He promised that he would make everything better, and all of my problems would go away if chose to be with him," she sobbed. She looked at me with profound sadness and regret. "It was me," she confessed. "I'm so sorry it was me. The happiness I felt in our marriage wasn't there anymore, and he promised to make me happy again." Her words hit me like a bullet to the heart. My wife and my best friend, the 2 people in the world dearest to me, who I trusted with my life, betrayed me. Together, I felt my own tears begin to well up and pour out of my eyes. "Why," I croaked, unable to think of anything else to say. "I still love you," she said with sincerity. "I always loved you. That never changed. But the magic was gone. I stopped being happy at the thought of you. The sweet things you do lost their magic and became routine. I wanted that happiness back. I craved the intensity of it, and he gave it to me, that's all." Her words were like a punch to the gut by a champion heavyweight boxer. I was left stunned, breathless, and unable to form a coherent thought. "Clarissa Hart," Krampus announced, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to speak. "You are on the naughty list." The elves crowded around my wife. "Naughty list, naughty list. You are on the naughty list." They chanted gleefully as they grabbed her, lifted her up, and began to march toward the bed. "No," I screamed. "I forgive her. I don't care what she did. We'll work it out. We'll find our happiness again. Don't take her from me. I love her." The only response I got to my pleas was a continued chant of "Naughty list. Naughty list. You are on the naughty list," as those demonic elves joyfully carried my wife, kicking and screaming apologies and professions of her love for me, to the iron bed. "You also are guilty of adultery. lying, and betrayal of the one person who loved and trusted you above all others, he declared. Your crimes were committed with the condemned man, therefore you will share his fate, just as you shared your own marriage bed with him. The elves shackled and stretched her exactly as they had to John. I turned away as she screamed in pain and terror, every pop of her joints sending a shudder of sorrow and regret through my body. You must witness this, Krampus said to me, in an almost sympathetic voice. She would have left you anyway, only to get her heart broken in betrayal. She cared far less for you than she did for her own selfish desires. I turned back to face the bed and lifted my head. All I could see through the haze of tears was blurry vision of a black lump of iron with 2 patches of color on top. I heard the sound of metal grating and sliding as floor plates moved, opening a blazing pathway from the fireplace to the bed, 1 panel at a time. My wife and my best friend screamed even louder and began to thrash, desperation overriding the pain in their dislocated limbs as they realized what was going to happen. Over it all, I could hear the booming sound of Krampus's voice as he declared, "Your bodies will burn together just as you burned with lust together." The elves surrounded me and carried me bodily across the room to a newly opened door. They dumped me through it, and it slid shut just as I heard the screams of the 2 people I loved best intensify as the flames reached the underside of the bed and began to heat the iron slab they lay upon. I lay in a crumpled head for I don't know how long, sobbing with intense sorrow at all that I lost. My friends, my wife, all gone, victims of a demonic entity meting out a twisted and final justice that nothing in me could reconcile as right or proper. We all fall short. We all make mistakes. None of us is truly innocent in this world. It's only a matter of degree and amount. Eventually, I opened my eyes, stood up, and looked around. I was in a cozy sitting room. There was a perfectly ordinary fireplace with a non-threatening fur cheerily popping away. There was a table set with a fine feast. There was a long, overstuffed couch. The room was festively decorated with all the trimmings of a proper Christmas celebration. And in a very large chair sat the demon Krampus, patiently waiting for me to notice him. "Take a seat," he said gently, motioning to the couch with one large, bony hand. Seeing no other course of action, I obeyed. "You are not on the naughty list," he declared with a soft authority, the wickedly mirthful, booming voice somehow absent. "What?" I replied dumbly, my mind not comprehending what I had just heard after seeing my wife and friends sentenced to torment and death. "You're not fully innocent," Krampus explained. "But minor infractions do not condemn a man, therefore, you are not on the naughty list." I sat there in stunned silence, expecting it to be some sort of malicious joke at my expense. I expected those horrible elves to show and start chanting about me being on the naughty list as they dragged me off to be tortured and killed. It didn't happen. "Why?" I croaked after I finally found my voice. "You think me a demon," Krampus stated. "That's understandable, but I'm not." "I don't understand," I said in soft confusion. Krampus nodded his head. "And you never truly will," he replied. "All you need to know is that I am tasked with rewarding people for the evil acts they commit. Not evil by any human understanding, but according to a universal truth that many deny even exists." "What even is that?" I asked softly. "The universe operates under certain rules," Krampus explained. "Good and evil exist because of those rules. Good is whatever follows the rules, and evil is whatever breaks them. The catch is that your kind is bound to break them. The only question is which rules you break, and how often. I don't know why, but something about being told that good and evil are universal and unchanging, that humanity has no say in the matter, incensed me. That doesn't give you the right to just murder people," I shouted, all of my pain, sadness, and rage coming out in a single exhausting burst. I slumped back in my chair, completely spent, suddenly helpless and uncaring. "Just kill me and get it over with," I sighed. Stop toying with me." Krampus chuckled, a real one, like he genuinely found me funny. "I'm not going to kill you," he declared with finality. "You're not on the naughty list. Instead, I'm going to give you a gift." I didn't have time to ask what he meant by gift before he was on me. He grabbed a hold of the front of my shirt with one mighty hand and lifted me up. Then, with his free hand, he pulled back his hood to reveal that, among his other horrifying features, he had horns like a goat, and this, straggly hair that seemed to flow and move of its own volition. He opened his mouth, and it stretched wider than any mortal man's mouth ever could, so wide that I thought he meant to eat me in a single gulp. Then he breathed. He breathed on me, a deep sighing breath that seemed to have no end. I reeked of carrion rot smothered with mint and cloves. I tried to hold my breath to avoid breathing the foul fumes, but it wasn't long before I found myself taking in a great gasp of air as my body overrode my mind and forced me to breathe whether I wanted to or not. At first, I felt nothing other than simple revulsion. I gagged on the foul breath and coughed like my lungs wanted to jump out my mouth. Then it subsided, and I found myself inhaling. I inhaled like never before, seeming to have no limit to how much air I could take in. I inhaled until every last foul fume that Krampus emitted was sucked in, and then he dropped me to the floor. I lay there coughing and sputtering as though my body were now rejecting the clean air now that Krampus had finished fumigating me. Krampus stood looming over me, like the specter of death himself, until I settled down and stood again on my own 2 feet. I looked up and saw his hood drawn far forward yet again, like it had been when I first laid eyes upon him. His eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. He said nothing, waiting as if in expectation. "What now?" I asked, coughing as I spoke. A door that I had not noticed before opened up to reveal a familiar snowy landscape. "Now you go out into the world and see it for what it truly is," he said in a voice that grew deeper and more foreboding with every word. "That is your gift. You will always know the truth about the people you meet. Never again will you be deceived." I started to speak up, to ask what he meant by his statement, but he hushed me and pointed to the door. "Go," he commanded in that booming voice I had come to know and dread. "Leave my workshop and never return." I turned and walked out the door and into the Christmas village. All was as it had been before we found and entered that wicked workshop. People were blissfully enjoying the fair and the cold winter air, a recent layer of snow coating the land with a cozy frozen blanket. I turned around, and the workshop was gone. Where it once stood was a town center filled with bustling shops and Christmas-themed carnival games. A drink vendor was off to one, calling out for people to come and enjoy hot spiced mead and mulled wine to warm their bodies on a cold winter day. I needed a drink, and I hurried over to the vendor, fully intending to order a hot mug of mulled wine, when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. I did a double take, looking at the man in stunned disbelief. I couldn't properly explain it, but as plainly as though it was written all over his face, I knew things about the man that I had no logical way to know. I knew beyond all doubt that this was a con man. I knew that he served cheap drinks that he labeled as expensive premium ones. I knew that he was a habitual liar who lacked an honest bone in his body. I knew that he sweet-talked many a gullible young woman into his bed for his own amusement, with false promises and declaration of affection, before moving on to a new town where he did it all again. I knew that he had murdered his own mother and made it look like a falling accident so he could collect her life insurance before the term expired. I knew about the vial of oleander toxin he kept hidden in his inside coat pocket so he could poison the occasional drunk, knowing it would look like a heart attack, and the coroner was unlikely to look any deeper. "What can I get for you?" the man said cheerily. A wide smile splayed across his face. "Do you have anything stronger than wine?" I asked, suddenly wanting nothing to do with anything this man touched. He pointed behind me to a small building simply marked, "Bar. Go there if you want liquor," he said with the same cheer and smile he'd originally had. I thanked him and left, heading to the bar at first, then turning down the street and leaving, wanting nothing more than to put as much distance between myself and the Christmas village as humanly possible.